Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and welcome to the latest episode of the Hard Compound Live. Thank you very much for tuning in. If it's your first time or if you're returning, you are very welcome. My name is Rich and I run and operate the Hard Compound. We're a one-stop shop for all things motorsport, and we can be found on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter and Instagram. Just search for the Hard Compound or at the Hard Compound on any of those. Come and give us a follow. Our aim is just to share a love of motorsport, whichever motorsport that may be, whether it be F1, IndyCar, touring cars, bikes, rallying, and anything we can shake a stick at, really. We usually put out 3 written articles a day, in the morning, lunchtime, and in the evening here in the UK. Excuse me. And these go out on our Facebook, Twitter, and our Instagram. We also do live video interviews, as you might have noticed, such as this one. These go out live on our Facebook, Twitter and YouTube only. They're saved on Facebook in the video section and on our YouTube in the live section. And we've had many terrific live guests. We've done over 100 of these, been very fortunate. I'm not going to name all the guests, but we've had guests from across the motorsport spectrum. We've had some drivers from the current British touring car and the Mini Challenge UK grid. We've had some British touring car legends, the likes of we've had Mr. Steve Soper, Frank Sittner, Rob Gravitt, Gabriele Tarquini, Ivan Muller, Rickard Rydell, Fabrizio Giovanardi, and many others. And we've had racers who have raced in F1, IndyCar, sports cars, from everyone from Mr. Derek Warwick and Stefan Johansson to David Brabham to Emanuele Pirro to Mika Salo. We've had Mr. Nico Prost has been on, and many others. We've also had the honour and the privilege of speaking to Mario Andretti, Jackie Ickx, Mr. Chip Ganassi, John Watson, Hans Stuck, and Brian Redman, and many others. And we've got another big name, certainly in my eyes, joining us this evening. Something slightly different. He's the first designer slash aerodynamicist that we've had on, and he is responsible for some of the biggest groundbreaking innovations in Formula One. And he's also responsible for some of the best and fastest cars in F1 history. I'm very excited as a fan of Williams. So we're going to bring him in right now. So without any further ado, please join me in extending a very warm welcome to the legend, in my eyes. That is Mr. Frank Dernie. There we are. Good evening, Frank. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Very well. Pardon the long rambling intro. It gets longer. But Frank, thank you so much for coming on and having a chat. As I said, I'm particularly excited about this. And I really
like
appreciate
talking
you
about motor racing.
Well, yes, I mean, we all love talking about racing and motorsport, and you have been instrumental, certainly in my childhood. So I'm very glad that you've come on for a chat. Just very quickly, folks, if you want to put any comments or questions in whichever platform you're watching on, we will see them in real time and we'll try and work them in as best we can. But yeah, firstly, Frank, how is everything with you? Obviously, it's a bit more sedate pace of life these days.
Yeah, I'm well and truly retired. I spend my time pretty well just with enjoying my dog, my grandkids, and all the things that I didn't get to do when I was working 60 to 80 hours a week in Formula One.
Wow. I mean, on the face of it, and especially me as a youngster, I mean, when I was growing up in the 80s, the thought of doing a long, working in Formula One often looked very glamorous and very fun and traveling around the world. And obviously, as I've got a bit older, I realized that wasn't always the case, but it was an amazing time you had, wasn't it?
So, I mean, the thing is, if you liked it, it didn't hurt, really. I mean, it was a lot of hours, and it makes me laugh a bit now because it's quite restricted now on what you're allowed to do, and there weren't any restrictions. But I mean, it's only hard work if you're not enjoying it, and I did enjoy it. So there were times when it was a bit stressful, but mainly it was being paid to do my hobby.
Which is never a bad thing, is it? I mean, if you can make a living doing your hobby, then as you say, then it never feels like work, which is wonderful. Right, and obviously we've got quite a bit to get through because you've had an amazing career, and as I said, you've worked with some amazing teams and some fantastic drivers, and some of them I'm sure were just as fantastic to work with, and some of them perhaps weren't. But but we can touch on that later. I guess the best place to start is right at the very start. Where did the interest in engineering and in motorsport come from?
Well, before my dad took up golf, he was quite into motor racing. And I remember, I think the first race we went to was at Alton Park in the 50s when I was quite small. And I was a fan of Archie Scott Brown. And I started following it. And of course, nowadays people won't realise, but there was nothing about Formula One on the TV. There was maybe a summary program on Radio 4 at about 11 o'clock on Sunday night. And if you missed that, there was a summary at about 6 o'clock in the morning on the Today program on Monday. And if you missed that, you had to wait for Motoring News to come on Wednesday. That was the only way of getting any information about it. So it's spectacularly different from now. But yes, I started following it. And the thing that intrigued me as a teenager was, why is it the one car's faster than another? That really, and that started loads of trains of thought about the various things that it could be.
So it was the car as opposed. I mean, obviously you said that you followed a driver, but I guess that quickly flipped into following the car, as you say, and why one was better than the other.
Well, yeah. I mean,
and were you just looking into it?
I was a fan of Jim Clark because he used to win everything he ever drove in, and I still am. I still think he was probably the best driver, certainly in my lifetime, the best driver there's been, in my opinion. Yeah, I was just intrigued as to why one car was quicker than another, because I had no ambition to be a driver. I don't think I'd be much use. Whereas I did have a loads of fascination about things mechanical. So it was inevitable that I'd be more interested in the car, really, or being an engineer in the business than being a driver in the business.
Sure. And you obviously had that mechanical kind of mind, which, some people do, some people don't. And I guess with the love of engineering and motorsport, the natural course was to go and get a degree in it.
Yeah. I mean, I'd done all the bits and pieces. I did do an apprenticeship, so I could learn. It's quite handy that when you come to design something, to know how you're going to make it. And I think that's a problem that some people have, that they've never made anything, and they end up. It's easier now, perhaps, with the computer-aided manufacturing, that you can get something made. But anyway, I found that to be quite useful to. But I did do a degree in engineering. I went to Imperial College because Keith Duckworth went there, and he was my hero.
He was the inventor of was it the DFV engine? Was it the?
Yeah, I mean, he started Cosworth with Mike Costin, and he was the engine guy, really. And I think they did a Formula 2 engine first, which they then raised funding from Ford to make two. It was called the FEA, which is basically a 4-valve engine stuck on a Ford block that they designed, and they then wanted to do a V8 version of it, and they got some money from Ford to do it in return for having Ford written on the cam cover.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Cool. And am I right in saying that sorry, when you were studying, you were also working? Was it with David Brown Limited, who then owned?
Yeah, I did my apprenticeship with David Brown's. Yeah, with their central staff. Yeah, my intention when I applied to be an apprentice there was to hopefully work for Aston Martin. But by the time I'd finished, they'd sold Aston Martin, so I never ever worked there. I worked on a 4-door version of the chassis for Sir David Brown's own personal use while I was an apprentice. But that was when I was in the workshop helping them weld it together, not anything to do with design.
Okay, right. I mean, so obviously you've got the degree in the engineering side of things and all the mechanics and everything like that, but something that kind of set you apart was your early use of, you wrote a computer program, didn't you?
Yeah,
was it Extension, was it?
Yeah, I did a computer for engineers course in 1970 and was rather taken with the whole idea of using a computer for engineering. And of course, it's a long time ago. Imperial College had 2 computers for the whole university at that time, rather than 2 on every desk like it is now, I guess. And you had to have a course in order to get a job number so you could actually use it. And to cut a long story short, I ended up, since motor racing at that time was all about suspension geometry, or that's what the competitors were telling the journalists, and the journalists were writing in the magazines, I decided that I would write a computer program to optimize suspension geometry. So I did. With the naivety of youth, it never occurred to me that there was anything new or unique about that. And when I mentioned the fact that I'd done it to a guy at a motor club meeting, his face lit up and wanted to look at it. And it was a guy called Harvey Postlethwaite, who at that time was a development engineer at March and who had come to give a talk to our motor club. So he then invited me to go up to March, and I met Max Mosley and some other people, and he proceeded to use my computer program from then on for analysing and designing suspension. And that's really what got my foot in the door, because I was then going to, when Hesketh started, I was going there and looking at, also analysing his wind tunnel data and comparing stuff, doing just generally looking at stuff. And when he left and went to work for Frank Williams Racing Cars, as it was then, I was doing work for them. So that's when I met Frank. And I went, I also met Patrick Head at the same time, and a guy called Gary Thomas, because they were both working for Harvey in a porter cabin in the car park at Frank Williams Racing Cars. That's what it was like back then.
Wow.
And anyway, when Hesketh decided to continue and do their own car, I got a call asking me if I go and work for them, which of course I shot across there as fast as you possibly could, because Nigel Stroud, who was doing the stuff, and he's a very smart designer, he was happy doing a lot of the stuff, but not things like suspension and structural calculations because of his background. So between the 2 of us, we ended up designing the 308E Hesketh. So that was me, started full-time on Formula One in 76, having worked on it part-time since about 71 or 2. And then that was me in. I've continued doing it from then on.
That was like the first steps in the dream job, I suppose.
The thing is, I did learn fairly early on that the suspension geometry didn't make that much difference, and it was all aero. So I then sort of redirected myself at analysing wind tunnel data a bit more. It's quite, I mean, I don't know whether this is, we used the same gearbox and rear suspension at Williams on the FW07, 7B, 7C, and 08 and 08C. So for 5 seasons, we used the same suspension and gearbox on the car because it didn't make any difference, and it wasn't unreliable, and it was strong and stiff. And if any of the journalists asked me when we made an improvement, which was always aerodynamic without fail, whenever they asked, I said, "Oh, we've done new suspension geometry," because they couldn't tell by looking at it, and it put the competitors off looking at what we were really doing, because very few people very few people in the 70s had really sussed that aero was by far and away the most important thing. It took a lot of, maybe even decades before a lot of people did, and certainly a long time before the enthusiasts were being informed about it.
Sure.
So,
wow.
But it was the most important thing.
Yeah. And
obviously so, right at the beginning of my career.
And you kind of obviously
I wasn't an aero. I hadn't really studied it specifically. It's just that I found that that's the way that made the car go quicker, so I concentrated on it. When I went to Williams, I had done a bit more wind tunnel testing than Patrick ever had, and had a bit more experience at it. So when we were and he's a brilliant mechanical designer, so he said, "Well, you better do the wind tunnel then." So I went off and did the aero side of things from the beginning, simply because I had a bit more wind tunnel experience. I'd not been trained as an aero guy, really. I learned it because that's what made the car quicker.
Wow, I love that. That kind of shift of focus when it became
Yeah,
obvious. It's,
yeah.
it's terrific. Just very quickly, just to backstep, there's a couple of things I've always wondered. Firstly, what did you make of the livery on the Hesketh? It was interesting, wasn't it, with the penthouse and Rizzler?
It's a bit misogynistic if you look at it from in today's eyes, isn't it? Yes,
Absolutely, it wouldn't be
but
allowed.
Rupert liked it because there were lots of penthouse girls used to show up.
I'm sure that was a good thing. I'm just on Rupert. I know he's suffering with a bit of ill health at the moment. I spoke with Chris Whitty recently, and he advised of that. So we obviously all wish.
Yeah, get well
Rupert
soon,
well.
Roops.
Yeah, we wish him well. Secondly, I appreciate you probably don't know too much about this, or you may not be able to tell, but we've heard about Hesketh, particularly through James Hunt and all that kind of thing, and Lord Hesketh and all the shenanigans they got up to, with oysters and the caviar and champagne and all that kind of thing. It must have been a unique working environment with those kind of chaps around.
Well, it was. At first I was just doing part-time stuff for Harvey, and I wasn't working full time, and so I didn't get many opportunities to discuss things with James, but I did, and so I got to know him reasonably well. But one of the things I learned back then is the importance of driver confidence in going quickly. If the driver is confident in the car, they can drive it faster. And that's not in any simulation program I've ever seen. So, I remember on one occasion with James, he was a little bit concerned. I won't go into the full details. He was concerned that the car felt a little bit loose in the fastest corner. And by convincing him that it would be okay, he went half a second quicker without changing the car at all.
Wow. Just say,
The fact that he no longer went into the corner thinking the rear might step out.
right.
The mere fact that he wasn't concerned about that anymore was half a second a lap.
Wow.
Without touching the car.
That's amazing how that works. I mean, it's just put me in mind of something I saw about 15, 20 years ago in a completely different sport, in golf. I think it was Colin Montgomery had a driver, and he said, "Oh, I keep pushing it off to the right. I keep doing this. I need some more loft putting on it, something like that." I gave it to the tour people who shaved the loft off and stuff. So they didn't do anything with it. Gave it back to him an hour later. Said, "There you go, good to go." And he went out there and he said, "Yeah, perfect." It's almost like it's like taking that doubt out of your mind, isn't it?
It is. It is one of my. It's not really a concern because I'm not involved anymore. But I think the simulation that we have to rely on now, because testing's banned, there are certain aspects of getting the best out of the car and driver in reality that can never be simulated on the computer program, and therefore I think the young drivers and the young engineers have got no way of learning what I learned.
Yeah,
it will remain a mystery to them.
It's more theory, isn't it?
Well,
in digital
the
theory.
simulations are amazing, but things like I could give more examples. For example, at I think it was 2004, Juan Pablo Montoya, I was helping Williams, and we had the car set up exactly as the simulator said it was going to be fastest. And onto the main straight, he was getting a bit of wheel spin and the hairpin onto the main straight, and the tyre wear was a bit concerning. And I was sure the tyres would go off in the race if we kept doing it like that. So I looked at the simulation calculation. Now, the young engineers would not have changed that. That was pretty well what they've been told to do. Because I worked with Juan Pablo Ganassis in IndyCars, he would do anything I asked him to because we knew each other quite well. And so I just stuck a little bit more rear wing on his car. And it was definitely, the simulation said it was slower, but again, it was near to half a second quicker because he had better traction onto the straight. The tyres didn't degrade, and the concern of it being slower on the straight and therefore less good for racing disappeared because he was so much faster onto the straight, his top speed was the same. Now, if we hadn't have tried that, we would have just ruined the tyres and he wouldn't have won. And if you had relied on the simulation to come up with the car setup, which they do now, you wouldn't, that opportunity to win wouldn't have happened.
Wow. That's fantastic. I'm fascinated by all this stuff. I love it. And you mentioned Chip Ganassi there. I love him.
He's a character.
He's such a great.
All the stories
He's
I
a great
know
because
about Chip Ganassi are things that I wouldn't be able to say on here.
I'm sure. I mean, he came on here towards the end of last year, and he comes across as this big sort of guy, stern. I like winners, and he's lovely, isn't he? He's a big, he's a gentle
and he
guy
does
when you get on
understand
the
his
right
racing, and he loves
He
it.
knows his stuff, doesn't he? Yeah, he's a terrific guy. So we've got the guys from the Keke Rosberg fan site viewing. We're going to, yes, we're going to come on to Keke very shortly because, as I've got in the notes, I'd like to run through just some of the cars and you're best known perhaps here for your time with Williams, which is obviously local to you. It's local to me. It's why I've been following them since I was 5. Obviously, you were working with Hesketh. They decided not to carry on. You went to Williams. Was that through Frank?
Yeah, it was Frank. I mean,
Patrick,
he'd been badgering me ever since I've been working with Harvey, doing quite a lot of the analysis of aero data and stuff like that. And therefore, Frank knew me and thought I was a smart young lad who he wanted to hire. So he'd been hassling me to move to Williams for quite some time. And when Hesketh decided to stop, I went because I knew Patrick. Not well, but I had a lot of time for Patrick. So I thought, yeah, why not? So I went and there were 23 of us.
That's crazy now, isn't it? I mean, there's like now more than that for a pit stop, isn't there?
Well, at Hesketh, there were 18 of us. So it was a bigger team for me. But the thing is, at Hesketh, we went to the airport in 2 Ford Granadas. So because there were 8 of us.
Wow. Ford Granada, the big.
They were the company cars, and that's how we got to the airport. So you can't imagine now having a race team of 8 people.
No. Wow, that's just on one wheel now, isn't it?
Almost, yeah.
Yeah, that's phenomenal. And I guess you obviously jumped at the chance to work with Frank, and obviously we all know what went on after with Frank and how good he was and what he was like, which we'll come to later on. The first car you worked on, I believe, correct if I'm wrong, was it the FW07?
Yeah. When I joined, Patrick had schemed almost all of it, probably 75% of it. Some of it was detailed, and they were making bits of it, and some of the car hadn't been finished designed yet, and I ended up with some of them. So I ended up doing, but the thing is, back then, of course, there were 4 people in the drawing office: Patrick, myself, Neil Oatley, who was a new graduate, and a draftsman. And we had to draw all the parts. So when you came in, you would look at what the guys in the workshop needed a drawing of next, and you'd draw that. So I drew all of the rear suspension on the Williams, apart from the uprights, because they needed parts. Now, it was a Patrick design. It's got my name on the drawing, but it was Patrick who designed it. But the bit that I designed with the skirt system and the side pods, basically.
Because obviously ground effect had come in around that time with Lotus, hadn't it? And as I mentioned in the intro, I had Mario on here, and you could tell even all these years later, he was talking about ground effect and the side skirts, and he had a little smile. He was just like, he obviously loved the way the car felt and everything. Just wondering how you implemented all that with the side skirts and removable ones and things like that. What was the thought process?
Well, to be honest, the biggest shock when you actually looked at the wind tunnel data was how massive the forces were. And people had been making all their bodywork out of polyester glass. And in fact, Lotus had continued to do so. It was reinforced with foam blocks. But when you looked at the numbers, firstly, keeping the skirts running freely with the massive suction inwards they had on them, particularly when the car was rolling away from them, was, I thought, the suspension and the freedom and all that was probably going to be crucial, because on the wind tunnel model, you take the skirts off the ground that far and almost all the downforce is gone. We've got ground effect now after a fashion, but that's by producing all sorts of whirly-swirly bits. It is nothing like the ground effect we had then. And without the skirt, it didn't work at all. So I put a huge amount of and then the underbody itself had so much load on it that you had to we made it out of aluminium honeycomb so that it would remain the shape that we thought it was going to be over the full speed range. I reckon some of the cars, the ones that were still making out of polyester glass, by the time they went out the pits, the side pods got nowhere near the shape they thought they had. Certainly nothing like the wind tunnel model.
Wow.
And I think actually, I mean, the only other cars that for me ever had adequately engineered side pods were the Brabham and the Ligier. All the others were not stiff enough. And I know Peter Wright's got a very plausible explanation for porpoising, but in my experience, he was wrong. People keep coming up with the same explanation, but it's just not true. And frankly, if it had been true, why would we get it again? Anyway,
true.
That's another.
It's something you can eradicate. I mean, just go back to the side skirts and the lift of everything. How good it was on the Lotus. I remember Mario saying he said that it was the first time that he'd laughed in a car going through the Lesmos Monza, and he was going, "This is ridiculous."
Well, I remember when we first ran the 07 at a test at before Long Beach. And it was at the old, what they call the circuit now, I can't remember. It had been an oval. They built on it now. It doesn't exist anymore. But we drove, there was a road track. And anyway, Jonesy came in and he said, well, I've tried everything, but I can't slide it yet. he just couldn't believe
which I guess.
And
I guess that's the biggest thumbs up.
The original version of it, we made a lot of improvements to. So... even though it was like that, there was still a long way to go with the 07 aerodynamically.
Yeah, absolutely. And just obviously, just on the last bit on the ground effect. I mean, obviously, it had been in play for 2 or 3 years, but around this time. I've also read somewhere that you felt you had a slightly better grasp of the concept of it than perhaps the late great Colin Chapman did. He obviously had the idea, but you kind of managed to get a bit more of a grasp on it, and that's what you thought, perhaps.
My understanding is it wasn't his idea at all. He obviously owned the team, but he came up with the idea based on, they tried wide track, narrow track, long wheelbase, short wheelbase. Mechanically, they'd done loads of suspension testing, because Colin was one of the old suspension wizards. And he'd come to the conclusion that in the testing that the car that produced the best performance was the widest, longest one. So he gave this to Peter Wright and said, right, stick it in the wind tunnel and then put radiators on it that don't add any drag. So Peter designed some aerodynamic nacelles for the radiator to go in, because obviously there was going to be potentially some drag by having these bits of bodywork to carry the radiators. And they were aerofoil shaped things, a bit like aeroplane coolers. And he'd made them out of cardboard and sticky tape like you did in the wind tunnel in those days. And he noticed when he was testing this that the downforce is increasing, and the downforce is increasing because these things were sagging. And being a smart bloke, he decided to work out why they were sagging, came to the conclusion it was ground effect, and made stiffer ones. But if Chapman had had his way, those side pods wouldn't have been on it. So, no, sure, he can take credit for it because it was his company, but it was Peter Wright who not only noticed it was happening, but also was clever enough to follow it up and make it into a car, as far as I'm aware.
Wow. That's
amazing. But as I say, they were made out of polyester glass. So as soon as they got some load on, they used to jam the skirts. And if the skirts weren't moving freely, you got porpoising.
Right.
And I don't think they ever, at Lotus, I don't think they ever discovered that. They tried everything because they were convinced it was the profile. So they tried changing loads of things it wasn't, but not fixing the problem it was.
Wow, that's amazing. I just want to say to everyone who's watching and seeing my reaction here, I understand the very, very, very basic principles of this. I'm not an expert. You clearly are. Just in case anyone's wondering why I'm nodding and smiling. Just want to quickly touch on the 79, that season. I've done, through the research I've done, I've found out that did you tweak the aero
all the
partway through
time.
the
I
season?
mean,
Was it between?
you started off.
Was it mainly between? Was it Dijon and
Well,
Silverstone?
no, I can't
Was
remember
one,
when it was, to be honest. It was
or was
definitely
it?
for Silverstone. I don't. But what I'd
Okay.
noticed was in the underneath of the car, the floor stalled round about the back of the chassis, and I came to the conclusion that the expansion and rate was too great in the back part of the diffuser. So I started messing around to see if I could put in some fairings and things like that would keep the flow attached further back, and did. I came up with some things. They looked amazing in the wind tunnel, so I literally came back to draw them overnight so they could make them. And we took them out to Silverstone, and they were mega. I can't remember how much faster they were, but it was a huge increase in downforce, and the car was a lot more competitive from then on.
Wow, that's perfect. Yeah, and certainly there was an upturn in the results and everything. So just going to quickly scan into the comment section just a second. The six-wheeler, we'll come to that. Rob Harbord will come to that. Vitolda Marosevska, she said, yes, love that. Real back of a fag packet engineering. Yes, proper job. And I saw earlier on that she also went to Imperial College London as well. So
yeah, well,
she's obviously
yes, the CAD thing. I was the first person to use CAD in Formula One because I wanted to. One of the things I'd found, and it was between the FW10 and the FW10B, we did two things. One was to get the engine cover an awful lot closer to the engine, and the other was a new gearbox rear suspension, and that was quite a lot faster than the FW10. And my experience with suspension was that the performance wasn't due to the suspension, and my experience with aero was that all the gains that we ever got were aero gains. So my deduction was getting better flow to the rear wing was the better was the step we made. So I then laid the driver down and drew round the driver and then tried to make a cover behind him that was never any bigger, that fed his head in and his shoulders in as well as I could. But of course, back then you just stuck a mock engine behind the driver and then you put filler and God knows what, and you daren't make it as close as you could make it with CAD. But the amusing thing is now you see these massive 3D models all moving on the computer. Back then, with a 50 grand workstation, if I surfaced a small section of the engine cover where the injectors would poke out, for example, it took about 20 minutes to surface, during which time it might crash. And if you wanted to rotate it, you had to move the whole model and then resurface it. So that would take another 20 minutes. So that's when I started drinking a lot of tea. I would set it up. Well, first of all, I'd back up the model because it often crashed and then you'd lost everything. And then I'd set it off and I'd go and make a cup of tea for me and Patrick and then go up and have a chat with him about what we were up to. So both of us ended up drinking a lot more tea.
Like the copious caffeine intake. Fantastic. Let's see, Kevin Bonwood. Good evening, Kevin.
Sorry?
A guy called Kevin White. Good evening, Kev. He said, I knew a guy called John Williams who worked for Williams as a designer for years. I believe he eventually moved to what was Sauber.
I'm not sure where he went, but I do remember him. But
yeah,
he was not
around
there in my, in my time. My main time at Williams was from the end of 78 to late 88. So I was there for 10 years, really.
Yes.
And I did go back when I got a phone call from Patrick and said, I'm sure our car's better than it seems to be. We need somebody with a bit of experience to help set it up. So will you come?
Right.
I ended up staying for another 3 years, I think.
Yeah. Super. Lovely. Something there was a tale that I heard for the first time very recently from you, and it sort of ties in 1979. Alan Jones's win at Montreal. I remember there being quite a tale behind that one. I was just wondering if you could just enlighten us very quickly as to what the deal was
for
there.
those fans who have really only been into racing when it's been massive teams and huge amounts of everything, it's difficult to understand how it was. There was one engineer looking after each car, and we both worked in the design office. We didn't have any such thing as a race engineer. In fact, early on, I think the only team which actually had engineers who were devoted to racing were Renault. All the other teams, the designer or designers of the car used to go to the races. So you had a direct feedback. The driver would, you definitely had incentive to get it right when you went back, because you got bollocking from the driver about a bit that you had drawn. Nowadays, they're so distant. I mean, you've got a race engineer, a performance engineer, a strategy engineer, and none of them probably have got any idea as to why somebody in the aero department made a swirly bit on the floor. Anyway, we at that time didn't do full tanks running until the warm-up. A lot of people don't do enough full tanks running now, actually, I discovered. But so typically we get the cars set up. We had 1.5-hour sessions in the morning and a 1-hour qualifying session on both Friday and Saturday. So it was very different. But at the warm-up, you'd fill the car up and you'd do a bit of a run and work out how things were going to be in the race. You'd work out your tyre wear, your fuel consumption, your brake wear, and all the rest of the stuff from the first time you'd had the car on the weight. And after the Jonesy had run, we measured the fuel consumption. Well, that must be wrong. Even if we filled the car full, we wouldn't be able to finish, because the car was burning more fuel than we had capacity for. You measured the brake wear, because it's such a difficult circuit, it still is on brakes. We ran out of brakes before the end of the race. So I had a situation where we were quick, but we weren't going to finish. Like, the calculation said you are not going to finish. So there's no radio, no data, nothing. I'm just thinking, well, what on earth can I do? So I just had a chat with Jonesy and I said, look, there's no way we'll finish if you go flat out for the whole race. So the worst wear and the worst fuel consumption is always when you're full. So take it steady, don't get too carried away, and I'll give you a signal when I think that you're probably okay to start racing. So the only sign we had that wasn't an instruction or had a direct use for the pit bull was the fuel pump sign, and the fuel pump was just a reminder to switch the electric fuel pump off at the end of the first lap. So I said, I'll give you the pump off sign when I think you can race, but just look after your car very gently until then. So he did, and we won. And it's still my favourite Grand Prix that I was involved in, just because it was so very difficult. And I was absolutely shitting myself for the whole race. But,
it's like
there was me there running Jonesy, and there was Neil there running Regga, and that was it. That was the total engineering staff.
That's amazing. And it was like trying to, I guess, win by going as slow as you can until you didn't have to go slowly anymore.
Well, I mean, up until we had pit stops for fuel, the clever drivers used to say you win at the slowest speed possible, because cars, of course, are much more reliable now. They're more expensive, but B, if you've got an engine that's by regulation you're only allowed 3 a year, it's going to be a more reliable engine than if you've got an engine that's been designed to do 500 miles, you hope. And therefore, the engines are much more reliable now. Everything's much more reliable, more people, more money, etc. Another 250 kilos. So it's really, I'm getting a bit stuck here. The difficulty with racing in general is getting to the end of the race without the car braking, because if you break down, you're not going to win, are you? And back then, most of the drivers knew that if they had a 5 or 6 second buffer to the guy behind, and they could maintain that, going faster was pointless, because if you went faster than that, you just risked breaking it. Whereas once we had fuel stops, you basically were qualifying lap every lap, because until the last pit stop. I
Yeah.
did hear from a very good source that Ferrari engines back in the Michael Schumacher day couldn't actually run at full power for the full Grand Prix without braking. And their philosophy was, as
Wow.
long as they had track position until the last pit stop, they would win, because it was pre-DRS, and as long as you could keep the guys behind you. So they used to run the car flat out until the last pit stop and then turn the engine down.
Wow.
That's how
There you go. I was
like that it was back then.
Wow, that's amazing. I was not
Well,
aware.
I can't promise you that,
fascinating.
but that's what I've been told by somebody who would know.
I'm perfectly happy to go along with that. Wow, that's very cool. I like that. Wow, amazing. We've got to jump onto that 1980. We have to do that because obviously it was Frank's first world championship after all the dealings from phone boxes that we're all familiar with and all the stuff that he'd been through and working so hard to get there. Did you kind of know that you were onto something good at the start of the year when, you know, you made some changes? I believe was this smaller fuel tank and there was a few other bits and pieces and you didn't need wings and all that kind of a thing. Did you think we can have a real crack at this?
I mean, we needed to make it more reliable. And in fact, one of the mods we made, which I won't go into the details, one of the changes we made for perfectly what seemed like logical reasons at the time, actually it was worse. So the 07B in one area was worse than the original 07 and the 07C for that matter. But anyway, yeah, the thing is how much we had in hand. Towards the end of 79, Jonesy was qualifying on the front row on the Friday by such a margin that he was so confident he wouldn't get out qualified on Saturday. He would either wander up and down the pit road in his civvies to demoralize all the other drivers, or he'd say, why don't we do a race run and do full tanks? And so we were very obviously out there when everyone else was like this trying to do a qualifying lap. We were doing a 15-lap run on race tires. And that's the sort of margin we had. I mean, they talk about Red Bull having a big margin now, but it's bollocks. I mean, they've got a margin, a lot of it being Verstappen, but this idea that they've got a bigger margin than anyone's had in the history of motor racing is ludicrous beyond belief. I mean, the FW11 had a bigger margin at parts of the time than that did. Anyway. Young people obviously haven't got the experience of the older stuff like an old bloke like me.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, as I said, I got, it was the FW11, which we'll come on to soon. It was the FW11 that got me into motorsport. And it's only been in the last 2 or 3 years that I've thought, that was a ridiculously dominant car. I mean, and so to have two of them so far ahead of everyone else, I mean, it makes the Red Bull thing look relatively close.
Is that the James Barker I know, who nearly spat his tea out?
Nearly spat me tea out. I'm sure it is. I'm absolutely sure. I'm sure it is.
Anyway, the thing that when sort of Nelson was very much win at the lowest speed possible, don't take any risks, and it really annoyed him having Nigel, because his view was that Nigel didn't contribute anything to making the car as quick as it was, because he wasn't very good at testing and which you can debate as much as you like. But he then was fed up that Nigel would take his setup and then race him with it, when Nelson just wanted to just stay in front and not race anybody really. But on one occasion when they were racing each other at Brands Hatch, they lapped everybody 3 times except Prost. And they'd already lapped Prost once, and he was P3, and he was within view of them lapping him for the 3rd time at the end of the Grand Prix. So that was the sort of margin that car had.
Was that 86?
I think it would be, but I'm not a 86. Big looker at history.
Yeah.
Possibly, yeah.
Wow.
So, talking about the Red Bull having an unfairly big advantage today is absurd, because it's bollocks.
Yeah, it's like there's people. There's like the guy in second is within 2 corners of him. That's close. It's
not being lapped 3 times by everybody. Anyway,
That's incredible. That's incredible. So yes, 1980. Obviously, you won the championship, and huge achievement for you. And we've seen some of the celebrations.
it was a
with
complete
Frank and
change for the company too, because you literally weren't sure when Frank bought your air ticket whether he had enough money to buy a return stub. In the early days, and obviously once we'd won and started winning, the money was coming in, and Frank, we were in a couple of rented units on a trading estate, and Frank bought some land, and we built our own factory, and I mean, it was a total change of everything. That was
wow, complete game changer, and obviously,
hi James,
and it went into 80.
It is.
The scene he's in there. Yes, it is. Yes, good man. Into 81. Ground effect banned. Was that a major annoyance? Or
yes, I was very pissed off about that.
I can imagine you might have been. Yes.
The thing was that it was sort of banned by non-engineering thread of thought by somebody who basically said, hi Jimbo, who said, if you have a flat bottom, it won't be able to generate any downforce. And I understand it was Jaby Cronbach, who is one of the French journalists, who proposed it to Jean-Marie Baleste. And between them, they decided, yeah, that will work. Well, of course, if you looked at how we ran the car, the ride heights, because it's all about ride height, the downforce is massively sensitive to the height above the ground, particularly with flexi skirts. And when we first put a flat bottom on the FW8, the FW8 had a bodywork lift to drag ratio of about 8.2, up from about 7.3 on the 07. And when we first put the flat bottom on it, without changing anything but the flat bottom, it had lift. It no longer had downforce at all. It would take off. So we had to put rake on it in order to get any downforce at all. And it still produced quite a lot of lift from that flat bottom. So I tried a couple of things. One was to say, well, I had tried already when we went flexi skirts, something that actually used the air sucking in from the sides to generate downforce, which was produced cones. It was killed by the front tire, so I didn't proceed with it. But that was interesting. But the flat bottom, we just ended up taking away as much of the side pod as possible. And the more side pod you took off it, the less lift you got. And so the OHC ended up with the shortest side pods. We get a radiator duct in. And I mean, the difference between the Williams FW OHC and the Brabham that Nelson won in was basically we had a radiator duct. They just left the radiator with no entry duct. But they had done the same thing. It just got rid of all the flat bottom. Or as much as they could. But the FWA OHC, as we started racing, it had an LVD of 1.6. So we'd lost about 80% of the aero by going to flat bottom. And so anybody who genuinely thinks that aero is the reason why there's no overtaking should look at the difference in overtaking between 82 and 83, and that'll tell you. None.
Wow. See, this is
problem
the
wasn't
stuff that I love, and I'm going to remember these. I'm going to put these little bits out there.
But yeah, we lost 80% of the aero performance going, and I was
frankly, incredible.
I was shitting myself because I was completely convinced. The first thing I'd done was made 2 ground effect wings, one at the front where you were legally allowed to, and one at the back. But I could never get that balanced. I had far too much front downforce for the rear. And when I saw the what was then the Tolman, which was very like my wind tunnel model. Oh no, don't say they made it work. But they clearly hadn't, because it wasn't quick. It did probably produce too much front downforce. But that was the sort of car that I'd been testing in the tunnel. And anyway, the OHC, I was convinced was going to be uncompetitive because that big a loss. So when Keke put it on pole at the first Grand Prix, I was relieved. And I knew we were going to be quick because we tested it at Rio before, and nobody else knew we were going to be quick, because we decided, because it looked quick, that we would do our qualifying simulations from the speed trap on the back straight rather than from the pits. So we would have how fast he could go, but half of each lap that the teams who were timing at the pits were slow. So we knew how fast it was and nobody else did, which was cool.
Oh, see, because that back straight was like 900 meters long or something.
We did put.
It was a colossally long thing, wasn't it?
We put, but we knew. I mean, we had a good balance in the car, and Keke quite liked it, and all the rest of the stuff. But I was so relieved because I was so totally convinced I hadn't got a good solution to the flat bottom.
But obviously, it all came to be, and it was very efficient, didn't it, aerodynamically? And
the problem was that the turbo cars had about 160 horsepower more than we did, which isn't trivial.
Yes, and that goes back to the good folk on the Keke Rosberg fan site. Hello, chaps. He said, they basically said, could you explain the challenges of competing with the FW708 against the turbo cars of '82, which you've touched on, because they were just so much quicker.
Well, they had much more power, but I do think they didn't. I don't think any of the people who had a good turbo engine understood the aero well enough. And since the aero is so crucial, they didn't really get that bit right. And with the flexi skirts, for example, I started testing the car with a lot of fuel in it at tests and practice, when it was clear that if you wore the skirts in the wrong place, the car would be a failure in the race. And up to that point, I'd always tested the car light, because the driver got a better feel, etc. But I discovered that if you tested it light in the race, it would cut its skirts and generally be a handful. And I think that's what Renault, for example, would easily beat us in qualifying, but about 15 laps into the race, they'd cut their skirts and we hadn't. And so we were able to catch them. I mean, they used to disappear, and then we used to catch them later. And that was because our car had more consistency due to the way we set it up for the skirt life, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. And that word consistency was obviously what got Keke the championship that year. I mean, he only won one race. I mean, if you tell anyone who's been into F1 in the last decade,
I shall never forget standing on the pit wall at Austria and seeing him almost catch Elio.
I must admit, that was a tremendous finish, and Elio's arms are up.
It was an exciting race.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one of those great F1 photos. Obviously, I mean, I was one, I think.
I wasn't.
At the time. I remember seeing it back and thinking, I've watched the race and thinking that must have been fantastic to be there. And you obviously were. And that was on the proper Österreich ring,
certainly
wasn't it?
I used to love that circuit so much.
Every single person I have ever spoken to on here who's driven it or been there, they've just said they loved it. I mean, even Stefan Johansson, who cut a gear in half.
I remember that.
Even he loved it.
No, it was a magnificent racetrack. But,
superb.
My favourite was Brands Hatch. If you could get a setup that worked at Brands, it worked everywhere.
Everyone says that. Everyone loves Brands Hatch every week. It's fabulous. Yeah, it's superb. So won the championship, and just to finish up on what the folks at Keke Rosberg fan site have asked, they said, "Did you enjoy working with Keke at Williams?"
I did. Yeah,
he always came across as a very likable chap.
He certainly wears his heart on his sleeve. I mean, it was a shame when he went to work for Ron, because all of a sudden, of course, Ron stopped him saying anything. But Keke certainly was capable of putting his foot in his mouth when he, if you got, if someone got a microphone in front of him when something had gone wrong. He did definitely talk before he thought, but he was just brilliant to work with. And there was the problem when we went turbo that neither he nor Jacques, nor I, nor Patrick had ever run a car with a turbo engine. And some of the things that we were looking for we thought were in the chassis were actually inherent in the turbo engine. We didn't find that out until the next year, sort of thing. So, but yeah, working with Keke was great fun. And to be honest, of all the drivers, I think 2 drivers in my career ever gave me anything as a thank you. One was my first year with Michael Schumacher. He gave me a gift. And Keke, when he retired, didn't give me anything at he gave me one of his race trophies, which is not something everyone's got. But one of when he retired at Australia, he looked me out and he got me a watch and he had it engraved. It says, "To FD from Keke, thanks for 1982."
Oh,
It's a lovely thing to have. And, you know,
that's really
most
lovely.
drivers,
And
it is a lovely thing to have. And it was very thoughtful of him.
That's lovely. Obviously,
and when he retired, he was the last of the drivers that were actually older than me by because I was quite young when I started. I'd worked with quite a lot of drivers who were older than me, but when Keke retired, they were all younger than me. So that was
it started to flip back the other way. Just in a nice comment there from Rob Harbord. Pole at Brands in '82. He said that he cried when the car wouldn't start. He was 13 on the South Bank. Well, firstly, thank you, Rob, for making me feel younger. So that's nice.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can imagine.
There's a really hideous story associated with that, which I'm not going to say while people involved are still alive, to be honest, because that should never have happened.
Right. But after 41 years, it's still it's fine.
No, we should have. That was a race where that car was. It was made for Brands. It was super quick. He should have disappeared into the distance. Anyway, it's all done now. I'm sorry you reminded me of that, actually, Rob, but there we are.
Rob, slap on wrists. How very dare you? Just to sidestep very quickly, I believe it was around this time. Obviously, you were still using the wind tunnel at Imperial College London. You were hiring it out, I believe. And I read somewhere that you came back from a week or so, or a few days in the wind tunnel, and you'd managed to find another 18% more downforce. I read somewhere, which is ridiculous.
I mean,
that's incredible.
Yeah. I think that 18% might have been the fairings on the floor of the 07. But, you know, getting those sort of improvements, it wasn't common, but you did get them. And it was the point that we did testing. There was all sorts of things we were doing to make the car quicker. And I had written a little computer program, which you'd now call a simulation, but it wasn't really. I'd written a program with a few straights of different lengths and some tight and some fast corners, and just computed how long it would take the car to get through this wiggly bit with various, and I had my nominal data, and then I would give it plus and minus 10% of the parameter, like 10% more power, how much difference does that make? 10% more downforce, how much does that? And because I was on my own doing the concept stuff, really, there were only a few of us, and you didn't have much resource, so you had to be absolutely sure that what you were working on would make a difference. You know, back in the Hesketh days, I still thought keeping the tyre the right way up vertical was very important. And it turned out that steering geometry I came up with to keep that didn't actually make the car quicker. In fact, it was better when we got rid of it. But we only actually ever ran one race like that. But, you know, you have to be working when the few of you on the things that will give you the biggest gain. Now, you've got 100 engineers, you can work on everything, even the things that might not work. And so that's what I did. And I discovered again that it was all downforce, really. The two things that make the most difference, other than the engine, are the friction coefficient, which is tyre temperature, basically, and the downforce. All the others are secondary or tertiary.
Just other bits.
There are some other things that make a difference, but that's because they make a difference to tyre temperature, which is the most important thing, really.
Yeah, gives you the grip and keeps you on the grey bit.
It's amazing how sensitive it is, and it is the only thing that influences mechanical grip.
See, that every day's a school day. I'm learning all this lovely stuff. We've got here, we'll come up with that in a second. We made up for it with the '83 Race of Champions. Yeah, Rear tyres, yeah, we'll come to that in a sec. Just quick, so yeah, using the wind tunnel, was it those results you were getting that you thought we need a wind tunnel at Williams? Because no team had their
No,
own wind
well,
tunnel,
it
did
was.
they?
I came back.
It was you and
I
Patrick,
came back
wasn't it, who
in
went
on
off
the
and
Monday after having had a week in the tunnel, and I'd been looking at what gave us the biggest gain. I just said to Patrick, you know, of all the things we do, we go to Silverstone for a day's testing. It costs us a fortune. We do this, we do that. But we come back from the wind tunnel and we've got a real gain. And we know from experience that when we make the parts, the car will be quicker. So the biggest thing we could do is to do more wind tunnel. And you couldn't book more time. And Patrick said, well, you know, when Peter Wright worked for Specialized Mouldings, he built a wind tunnel up there. And I wonder what's happened to that. So he rang the guy who owns Specialized Mouldings, whose name's got out of my head, sadly, at the moment. But anyway, Patrick knew him from his days at Lola, and said, what have you done with have you still got that wind tunnel? He said, yeah, it's all in bits in a hangar up in Huntingdon. Why? And Patrick said, well, we might want to buy it. So, and we literally got in his car that morning, as soon as he got off the phone, drove to Huntingdon, the two of us. We had a look at the tunnel. I had a look at the tunnel to decide if it was going to be much use for what I wanted to do. Patrick had a chat with his mate who'd owned Specialized Mouldings, who I hadn't seen for ages. And before we went home, they'd shaken hands on a price. 7.5 grand.
which was obviously a lot.
Well, yeah,
but
it wasn't a lot. I ranked that cut, and we then had
not compared to what it could have been.
And of course, Ross Braun was the R&D technician then, so he organised the low loader and all the moving. It didn't have a moving ground, and it didn't have an adequate balance. So I designed a moving ground based on what had gone wrong at the Imperial College one, and Ross made most of it. I chose a computer and wrote some software for it. We looked for a balance. I found a balance eventually. Of course, back then, you couldn't just go and buy a computer. We ordered the computer, and it took 3 or 4 months to come. It was a process control computer called a Maxim 2. And the balance was made by TEM in the south of England somewhere. And it was a balance they designed and they had drawings for, but they hadn't made one recently. So it wasn't something they carried in stock. So, you know, we were, and between us, I wired it and, you know, drew all the electronic bits, wrote all the software. Ross built the whole thing mechanically and assembled the floor and all the rest of the stuff with help from mechanics back in the workshop when we needed a bit of a lift. And there we were. We had our own wind tunnel, and I reckon that coming first and second in the first 2 races of the season paid for that wind tunnel. It was already, we were already in credit.
Wow! So that was one of the big things for that for that period. That's amazing. Just to tie up this kind of era very quick, so I'm looking at the time and everything. Rob Harbord has mentioned 2 things. Rob is a Keke Rosberg fan, clearly. 83 race of champions. How did those rear tyres last with Danny Sullivan chasing? Danny Sullivan, underrated and a lovely, lovely man.
He is a lovely man.
We like Danny
and to
Sullivan.
be honest,
He's a
I'm very
great
sorry
guy.
to say this,
One of
Rob,
my
but I
favourites.
don't remember. I can't answer that.
Keke made it work. Keke just made it work. Good stuff. And also, he did mention the 6-wheeler.
Yeah.
I think basically what he was alluding to was why.
Yeah. Well,
I
mean, one of the things that we were looking at, because we didn't have access back then to a turbo car, and we knew what sort of power levels they had. So we were saying, well, what can we do to reduce the drag of our car to give us similar top speed to the turbo cars? And because the drag very much dominated by the frontal area of the car, making 4 small rear wheels, one, you know, in the layout that we chose, gave quite a lot of reduction in frontal area and a reduction in drag. So that's why we did it.
Wow, that's very cool. Very cool.
It had other benefits,
yeah,
to be honest, because the overhang of the rear wing was defined in the rules as the distance from the rear axle.
Okay.
Whereas the effective rear axle on a 6-wheeler is between the tyres. So we effectively gained about that much rear wing overhang as well.
Oh, right.
In terms of
Yeah,
effectiveness and that sort of. So there was quite a few. The downside was the weight. we were really, really worried about how close to the weight limit we'd be able to get. But anyway, it got banned before four-wheel drive was banned. That's what banned it.
Yes, yes, which was obviously put paid to it. We've got one of our friends, I believe, from Italy, Christian Andrea Arcuri. He said he wants to hear stories about you and begging of the job. Of you begging the job with Frank. He's also said that he'd like to write to you at some point. I'm sure we could sort something. I could be a middleman or something, or we can. I will contact you, Christian, if you stick around on Twitter. Thank you very much. We could maybe see. I just want to fast forward. I've got to talk about the FW11. I mean, you'd already come up with the active suspension previously and all that kind of thing.
The idea of the active suspension, it was entirely aero control. It was to stabilize the aero platform, because the flat bottom cars were horribly unstable and aerodynamically unstable. And in fact, up to Senna's death, the only things that happened to improve that came in after Senna was killed. My entire thinking about the active suspension was so that I could keep the aerodynamics in the best working window. And it was nothing to do with suspension dynamics at all.
Oh, right.
It was entirely aero.
Just to sort of level it off and
just keep it at the right angle. It wasn't just to level it off. It was to, I mean, you can adjust the balance of the car. You can do a lot of things with active suspension, as well as making it much safer.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I read obviously the FW11 was as I said before, it was the car that got me into F1 with Nigel and with Nelson. You were running Nelson's car.
What happened after Frank's accident, how it had worked before Frank had his accident, was that I used to do about half the races running the number one car, and Patrick used to do the other half. And the way it worked was, basically, I would do the first quarter and the third quarter, and Patrick would do the second quarter. Sorry, I'm getting it all confused. It doesn't matter which quarter I did, but basically we shared it because we had our own stuff to do back at the factory, because there weren't many of us. And once Frank had his accident, I mean, Patrick ran Williams really anyway. Frank was there trying to get cash out of sponsors and stuff, but the day-to-day management and everything about Williams was all down to Patrick. He was the key guy, really, which is why it didn't fall apart when Frank did have his accident. But he then had to go to all the races as team principal, which meant some of the time he was going to be in a meeting that he couldn't avoid, and we had cars to run. So we decided then that maybe it was time to get a race engineers. And so basically, we took John Piper came in from the drawing office, who hadn't been a race engineer, and he nominally ran Nigel, with Patrick, as it were, looking over his shoulder. And I ran Nelson, and I trained up a trainee race engineer by letting them run the spare car. And the trainee race engineer in '86 was David Brown, who subsequently went on to McLaren, and my trainee in '87 was James Robinson, who stayed at Williams and he was a Senna's race engineer for a while as well. So they were my apprentices. But it was difficult, because it meant really that I was at all the races, as well as trying to develop the active suspension and do the aero, whereas hitherto I'd only been at half the races, and Patrick ditto. So it was a tough time, really.
Yeah, and it was obviously, I vaguely remember it happening. I mean, my recollections of Frank have only, even my early memories of seeing him on TV was he was wheelchair bound because he'd had the accident at that point. I mean, it must have, obviously it changed how you worked, as you've just touched on. It must have really hit everyone hard, obviously, especially, with like Ginny and with, Claire and everyone. It must have.
Well, see, Claire and Johnny were
one of the most wonderful photos.
I was there when he had his accident. We were testing at Ricard.
In France.
and the car was
Yeah.
looking really, really quick. And Frank never
Yeah.
went to tests. He hated them. They were boring,
Yeah.
you know. And he had come
But
because
was
he wanted to see how we were going. And he went full of the joys of spring back to the airport because he was going to run in a half marathon the next day with us being.
Because he was with Peter. Was he with Peter Windsor, wasn't
Peter
he?
Windsor
I
was in
believe.
the car when he drove. And
Yeah.
they set off to go back because Frank went off at lunchtime. And as bad luck would have it, we'd had a little fire on the car, a fuel leak, and we were just so much quicker than everyone else at the test at that time. I said, well, I'm not really sure whether we've damaged the structure of the chassis. We've done our test program. We're quicker than everyone else. Let's go home. It's time to go. And soon after we started packing up, a French youth appeared on a moped asking for me and saying Frank Williams had had an accident and was asking for me. So I thought, well, silly old sod, he's gone off and he needs a shove back onto the, I thought he'd be, wheel in the ditch or something. And because Nelson knew the route he was taking, Nigel, myself and Nelson's doctor got in Nelson's car and set off down the route we knew he'd taken. And we actually got to the accident before the ambulance. And when we got there, Frank was out of the car, lying with his head on his briefcase. Peter Windsor had pulled him out because he was frightened it would catch fire. Peter was fine. And Frank had only got a scratch on his head. And he was just swearing and complaining his arms hurt. And I looked at his arms and thought, nothing wrong there. Anyway, when the ambulance arrived, they put him in some pneumatic thing and gently put him in the ambulance and set off towards the hospital at like 10 miles an hour. So I'm thinking, oh, shit, this is much, much worse than I thought. And then they stopped in a lay-by and a doctor came up from the hospital and started working on so it was obvious that it was pretty serious. And it was a Sunday. And it was Toulon Hospital we went to. And the senior doctor was off because it was Sunday. The doctor who was there was a young guy who'd never had an accident like this before. He showed me the x-rays. And of course, everyone's there. When you design Formula One cars, everyone thinks you're a hero. So Peter Windsor's saying, tell him what to do, Frank. Tell him what to do. As if I might know. No. And anyway, the senior doctor came and he'd obviously been having a few drinks with his guests at home. Was, I wouldn't say he was drunk, but he certainly wasn't. And he looked at the x-rays, said, well, first he said, who are these clowns in my hospital? He didn't know I speak French. And then he looked at the x-rays and said, this man's going to die. I'm going back to my guests, and fucked off. Excuse my French. So that's him gone. And the young doctor then is in a bit of a panic because he's a famous bloke and what are we going to do? And I said, well, what did you learn to do in college? And you better do that. And in the meantime, they arranged to take him to Marseille hospital to where they can do a proper operation. Nelson's been on the phone to Bernie. Bernie has arranged for his aeroplane to go and pick up Sid Watkins. So Bernie had contacted Sid. Sid was then taken to Bernie's plane, presumably at Biggin Hill, got on the plane. We went, the ambulance set off with Frank to Marseille Hospital. We got in Nelson's car and went and picked Sid up from the airport and took him to the French hospital where, obviously he was well known, but they weren't delighted to have someone looking over their shoulder. And then we just hung around for hours whilst they did the operation. And anyway, with Sid coming out every now and again saying, oh, no, they're really good. They know what they're doing. It's all going well. And, Sid was keeping us informed about what was happening. And when the operation was over, it was all, it's done as best as he could. He's still alive and all the rest of it. And we went back to the hotel for a kip. We were due to fly away. And I was traveling with Nigel in his rental car. And so Nigel said, why don't we go and see Frank on the way to the airport? So well, why not? We'll go and see Frank. So we arrived at the hospital to see Frank, and he's in intensive care. And they basically told us to piss off. There was absolutely no way that you could see him. So Nigel sent them off on some sort of, threw a bit of a wobbly and said, you go and fetch somebody more important. And when they went off, we just walked in. And so there's, so that was a bit easier to get forgiveness and permission. And so there's Frank, and he's got his head all, and he's conscious. And he looked at Nigel, and he looked at me, and he said, well, who the fuck's testing then? So I thought, oh, he's okay, the brain's all right.
Right. Yeah, the brain works.
Ever going to be, so because that was exactly what he would have said. So, and that was that.
Goodness me, that's incredible. Yeah, I think a couple of people in the comments as well are saying the same thing. Wow. And just to fast forward, I mean, you know, the win at Brands in '86, with that photo of Ginny with the trophy, it was that look of, yeah, we're still here.
Yeah.
I mean, it was.
Yeah, of course, the kids were kids then. I mean, I was Uncle Frank to Claire and Johnny and Jamie. They were, I mean, Jamie was born in '82.
Yeah, he was only 4, wasn't he? But I've actually been in contact with Claire in the last few weeks, so watch his space.
Because we actually, the flight we went home on was the flight that Ginny and Patrick flew out on. So we had a brief chat with them at the airport as they were going to the hospital and we were going home. It was horrific, to be honest, because who knew what the future was going to hold then?
Yeah. But it didn't dampen anything in Frank.
No, it was, nothing did. Frank
obviously made even more.
As long as I've known him, he was only interested in motor racing. Even after I'd left, we were mates all the way through. I was still going to see him once a fortnight or so, up to COVID lockdown, in fact. But he, I remember, I rang him up on New Year's Day one year and said, "What are you up to, Frank?" I knew very well that he'd be really pissed off that no one was at work, because he worked every day. There was no, what would you want a day off for? And I knew that he bought a new factory. So I said, I chatted. He said, "Oh, come on then, I'll show you. Don't tell Patrick I'm showing you," because I was working for some other team by then. And so on the New Year's Day, when no one was working, Frank and I were looking around his new factory. So he had not a moment where he wasn't thinking about motor racing, really. Wow. Never.
And that's where he got to where he got to, of course. And I never met Frank, but he's such a like an icon.
Well, he was my mate.
And he's hugely missed, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, just quickly back to '87, the FWMB. I read that you did a lot more testing. Well, you did testing of it and development of it with Nelson, because Nigel didn't.
That was only the active. Nigel had basically said with the active suspension, he'd had some bad experiences with the Lotus. He didn't believe for a moment that it would ever work, personally, and he wouldn't drive it. So he didn't do any of the dirt. Nelson did it. We had, I can't remember whether Jonathan Palmer drove it. He might have, but Jean-Louis Schlesser, who did quite a bit of testing for us, he did quite a testing of it, and Nelson did lots. But up to the point at which Nelson won its first race at Monza, Nigel had refused to drive it, and then he wanted one.
Really?
Surprise.
Of course. Yeah. Was it true that Nigel just went no, but Nelson came back from Brazil?
Yeah, that is true. He was I think living in the Isle of Man at the time, and Nelson was visiting his mum in Brasilia. And I'd asked the race team secretary, "Can you get Nigel to do it? Because Nelson's not even in Europe." And so she tried, and he said, nope. So we rang Nelson, and Nelson flew over, did the test, which was at Silverstone, then flew back to Brazil to see his mum again. And that was the difference between them, a bit in a nutshell. Yeah. I mean, Nigel's a great fast driver, no doubt about it, but he has some pretty weird ideas.
That feels like a discussion for another day. But obviously '87, it was that pass at Silverstone sticks in my mind, absolutely incredible. And as we alluded to, the two cars were just so much better, essentially, than anyone else. It was incredible.
It was good. And I mean,
Incredible.
Nelson said I had two choices: die or let him by. He said Nigel just drove straight at him, and Jonathan Palmer had actually said the same when he was being lapped. He said Nigel he was just taking every risk that was going, and he said if I hadn't have got out of his way, we'd both be dead.
Wow.
So he definitely wanted to win.
Interesting. Yes,
And did.
come what may.
Yeah.
Just a quick question here from Chris McMahon. Evening, Chris. So after Imola in '87, for those of you who don't know, Nelson had a big old shunt at Tamburello and I believe damaged his ankle.
He smashed his head against the wall, that's for sure.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
It says, did you notice a difference in Nelson
I would say
after that?
Before that, Nigel was never quicker than him, actually, in reality. I mean, he might race more extravagantly, should we say, but after that, there was not much between them. And he couldn't, I found out, I was told afterwards, he couldn't see all that well afterwards. He's short. His long vision was normal, obviously, but he's, seeing what was going on in the cockpit, he couldn't see as well after that.
Oh, right, okay.
And it still makes me cross that. I might say something that they still continue to give Imola a racing license, because he crashed there, Alboreto crashed there, Gerhard had a massive fiery shunt there. And every time, I mean, I sat on the FIA technical working group, I would always raise the fact that they needed to do something about Tamburello because someone was going to be killed there. And every time
because they
couldn't do anything about it because there was a river behind it. Senna gets killed and they put a chicane there. And
why couldn't they do it? Yeah. It was almost like they got away with it.
Well, I think
for long enough.
The reality of management is if a manager gets told by an expert they're going to have to spend some money, they ignore it until their nose is rubbed into it. That's been my experience. And the fact that experts have been telling him for years, I mean, because Jackie Stewart raised it with them, it wasn't just me, had been telling him for years, didn't work. They needed it demonstrating to them. It still makes me very cross.
Yeah, I'm sure. There's a lovely comment which I'm going to read out towards the end. There from Shelley Ryan. Hello, Shelley. Very quickly, one thing I just want to fast forward a little bit. FW12. Now I've got a little funny thing about this. FW12. It's the first. My first F1 weekend was Silverstone '88 qualifying. Managed to get grid pit access and all that kind of thing, which you could do then. And obviously, I made a beeline for Williams and Nigel Mansell and the FW12. And then, was it 24 years later, I met Nigel Mansell at Grove, talking to him in front of that car, which is very, very cool. But this is very funny. I bought a mug, right, as a fan. Well, my dad bought me a mug. And of the FW12, it says Nigel Mansell, Williams Grand Prix Engineering on it. And it wasn't until I moved house for the third time in 2012 that I realised that it says Willems. It's missing an I. It took 24 years. Well, at
least it's not that crucial then.
And I was packing it and I looked at it and I went, that doesn't look right. And I took about 10 minutes. I went, that says Willems. And it's still in the cupboard and I don't use it because I don't want it to get broken, even with the typo on it. But yeah, absolutely brilliant. I love it. But yeah, I mean, that car, unfortunately, it was when Honda went, didn't they, with Nelson to Lotus. And, I guess that brought its own problems, didn't it?
Well, I mean, it's a complicated thing, but the thing that I still kick myself about with that car was we never managed to get the active suspension working properly. It was the reservoir. We always used to pick up air. And Nelson, this is with the Judd engine. We were we were not the most powerful car, should we say. And Nigel would go out after we freshly bled the system. We would have a purple sector. The second sector might be purple. And then the car would have so much air in the hydraulic system, he had to come in. So we never, ever did that showed how quick the car could have been, but it's my fault. I mean, it was my reservoir that didn't work, but we never fixed it. In fact, there were some people who didn't really think that it was the reservoir that was the problem, which was part of the reason why it didn't get fixed, but that's a separate thing.
Okay. But it did go very well at
Mm.
Silverstone in the wet in '88. I do remember that. It came second. Just very quickly, I mean, just to sum up, Williams, before we jump on, and we're just going to pick on a few other cars very quickly. But what were Frank and Patrick like to work for? I mean, I have it in my head that there was some, and I don't mean this in a negative way. There must have been some ego there, because they're just both very, I don't know. You know, Frank is Frank, and Patrick always came across as being almost like a sergeant major type person. I was just wondering what your experiences were of them, if there was anything like
Frank
that.
was nearly always away getting cash, and Patrick and I were mates, to be honest. And it is true, he's a very sergeant major chap, and you'd certainly he didn't take any messing, and you knew where you were with Patrick. But because we're not the same age, but we had a similar experience level. He knew far more about mechanical, or he's much better mechanical designer than I am, but I knew more about aero than he did, and we were doing our own contributions, and we were just mates. So it was never. I do know an awful lot of people at Williams were terrified of Patrick, but I wasn't one of them. As I say, and he still. I was talking to him today. We're still mates.
Oh, okay. Ah, good stuff. Now there's a chap I'd like to speak with.
He won't want to talk about motor racing. He doesn't.
I'm sure he's
doesn't want to even think about it anymore.
Yeah.
He lives in Milan and Sardinia as well.
Oh, very nice too. Very nice.
I don't think he was best pleased by Brexit, so he decided he didn't want to live here anymore.
Decided to vanish. Yeah, it's amazing how sort of people vanish to Italy and want to leave motorsport behind. One was Jody Scheckter I spoke to recently. He's the same. He's like, no, done that, which is fine. Right,
similar blokes.
That mug has to be. Yeah, absolutely. That mug has to be a right rarity with a typo. Yeah, well, you never know. Yeah, I'm not selling it. So yeah, okay. You moved over to Lotus. As was it technical director or?
Well, that was Nelson's doing. He said, I'm going to phone you at 8 o'clock in the morning every day until you agree to come. And he did. Every morning at 8 o'clock, the phone rang. Used to piss my wife off after a while. And they did offer me more money. And I went. And I think I discovered late in life that I've probably got Asperger's. It's never been officially diagnosed, but I did the questionnaire, and the questionnaires got, scores, and there's one score above which you almost certainly haven't. Then there's a span where you might have, but you probably haven't. And then there's a score below which you almost certainly have. And I am well below the almost certainly have. So it's clear that I work better on my own or with a small team. And therefore, I'm not a good manager of people. I got to Lotus only to find they'd cancelled their contract with the people who they were doing a wind tunnel and done a new contract with a new tunnel, which wasn't working yet. So plus I had an aero guy anyway, so I wasn't doing it anymore, which was a first for me in 10 years. And so the 101 had everything I knew in my head. We had no wind tunnel, so everything I knew about what it should be like, but we never really made any improvements at all because the wind tunnel either didn't work or none of the things that the guys tried made it any better, which was a shame. Then it wasn't a bad little car to start with. We did a test at Imola, in fact, with lots of chicanes and stuff built with cones just before Monaco, and had a setup where we thought we'd have with the power we had, and we'd been reasonably good at Imola, apart from the battery had gone flat with Satoru's car. And we thought, we might be able to do something at Monaco. We arrive at Monaco only to find that the spec tyre has changed. They brought out the official spec tyre for that year. And we never managed to set the car up again. It was a tyre that had been developed on the McLaren. And the McLaren proceeded to win pretty well all the rest of the races. And we could never get it to set up. And that taught me a lot, that you do need to do the tyre testing. But we just couldn't balance the car on the new tyre. And I was lost at Monaco, tried at the next Silverstone test back to back between the old tyre and the new tyre, and sure enough, the car was fine on the old tyre. So I just said to the Goodyear guys, "Why can we have the old tyres?" And they said, "Nope, the rules say it's got to be a fixed tyre. This is the one we've chosen. That's what you have to adjust your car to suit." And we never managed, literally never ever got a balance again. And that was at Monaco, which is very early on.
Yeah, wow, because this was what 89, wasn't it? Yeah, and just to sort of jump onto the following year, I believe the car was fairly similar. The 102 was quite similar, apart from the Lamborghini engine, which was a bit bigger.
The gearbox was
the
gearbox to engine junction was the weak point in that car, but there we are. But
yeah. Well, I had Martin Donnelly on here last year, and it's Martin's birthday today. So happy birthday,
60,
Martin!
Indeed.
If you see this, Martin, what a lovely chap. Thoroughly lovely chap. I'm going to come on to what happened very shortly, but he said when he joined, he said he couldn't understand how the car had not been so good the year before. I said it was a good car to drive. He enjoyed driving it. It was a nice car to drive. And obviously, you've just said that it was on the tyres, which is obviously which was the reason. Obviously, I'm kind of loath to ask this because we know what happened with Martin at Jerez 1990. I also had Derek Warwick on here. He said that he never felt fully safe in the car because of the monocoque and everything like that. I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Well, I don't know why. I mean, clearly the car was royally destroyed in the shunt at Jerez. But
yes,
looking at it from the, I mean, the car hit almost at 90 degrees, a barrier. There's never been a worse accident than that in Formula One in terms of the fact that the car had to stop in a very short distance. And if the car hadn't continued collapsing, it did collapse to about where Martin's hips were. And it obviously made a mess of his legs. But it meant it stopped over a distance of 2 or 3 meters. So the peak G that he experienced was horrible, but he survived it. Whereas the only other similar accident I've ever seen was it Gonzalez in the Penske's Reynard, I think, at Laguna Seca. And he did the same. He hit more or less. And of course, that car was IndyCar solid, and the nose box was only about that long. So he slowed down over that distance. Similar accident other than that, and he was killed by the G-force. He was basically dead by the time the car over because it stopped in too short. It was an unsurvivable peak impact level. And I mean, the Lotus chassis, the effective layup was the same all the way through, and so it got progressively stronger as it went further back because it got bigger in section. So it did collapse progressively from the front. There were a lot of bits at the end, but I suspect, I've no idea what other cars would have been like if that happened, but we did make a high modular chassis because the car wasn't as stiff as we wanted it to be because of the engine to gearbox junction, which I won't go into. And that was the one that he rolled on the first corner of the first lap at Monza, and it ground away the whole side of the car. So that never raced. The high modulus carbon chassis. It was destroyed by the first corner. No, sorry, by the last corner of the first lap. So that was a chassis that never raced, but it didn't make any difference. Because it was a stiffer chassis, and it didn't make any difference.
Yeah, sure. Just seen a lovely comment here from Craig Homer. Said he was a massive Lotus fan. Said they never made an ugly car. All of them were things of beauty. Agreed. And everyone who worked there should be proud of it, even the lean.
Kind to say so.
We miss the team. Yes, we do miss Lotus. They were tremendous.
Yes, the thing is, though, you know, times change, and I mean, Lotus were one of the greatest innovations Colin did, and people will laugh at this. Was he realised that it was all about money? He was the first guy to get massive amounts of money in. And when Lotus were winning all those times with the John Player cars and everything, they had way more money than anyone else. And by the time they stopped winning, They had way less money than everyone else. So, you know, it just goes to show,
Direct
generally
correlation.
speaking, the teams with the most money, like Mercedes and Ferrari, had the most money. And surprise, surprise.
Yeah. Guess what's happened? Yeah. See, this is the thing. People always say, "Oh, it's all about money these days." Yeah, you can take these days. You can take these days off the end of that.
It's like
Year
aero,
dot.
you know.
This was born.
Someone's complained to me, so it's all aero now. I said, well, it was all aero in 1970. It's just not many people knew.
Yeah,
The difference isn't that it wasn't all aero back then. It was just that not many people realised it was all aero back then.
Yes. Joe Public didn't have all the info. Okay, just to sort of fast forward, Benetton, you were involved with Benetton. You were involved on the car that gave a certain Michael Schumacher his first win. Just wondering about your time there, your inputs on the car, and all the nonsense about cheating regarding electronics.
Well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I being a bit autistic, I don't do cheating. My whole philosophy of racing was, if you can't beat them by being clever than them, you don't deserve to win. So cheating is out as far as I'm concerned. And pretty well everyone who's worked with me knows that I wouldn't have it.
Yes.
Now, I was chief engineer of Benetton. There are two things I can say is, in 93, when it was legal to have traction control and automatic throttle, we didn't have a system that worked. Cosworth insisted that the control was hydraulic of the throttle, whereas everybody who had a quick acting traction control, etc., used it by ignition, by electronics, timing and spark cut. Now, it would be possible, so firstly, we didn't have a good traction control system when it was legal, so the likelihood of us having one when it wasn't is not high. Secondly, it would have been possible for somebody in the team to have, for one person in the team, who I shan't name, to have done something that I wasn't aware of while we were testing, if they wanted to do it and hide it from me, because, as I say, I'm well known as a person who thinks cheating is not the right way to win a race. But my view is the reason why Senna thought we had traction control is we had some quite tweaky aerodynamics that gave us better grip at low speed, which he didn't have, and which we wouldn't have said about, because you're not going to tell the opposition what they're doing wrong, are you? And so whilst I personally believe we never had traction control, I do know why we have better traction than the Williams, and I ain't saying even now it was aero.
No, fair enough.
And so yeah, I don't believe. And the other thing is, we did have, when you've got a complex bit of software, it is very risky to cut a lump out just in case you remove something, you know, like you cut a cancer out and, oh dear, I've taken a nick out the lung. I didn't mean that, but that's happened, and now you've died, oh dear. So you can do this. It's the same with the computer program. And so the Benetton just switched off all the traction control bits in the software and just didn't use it. And funnily enough, I went to Ligier. I was loaned to Ligier when Flav bought it. And sure enough, in the filing system was, post all the scandal about Benetton, was a letter from Steve Wise at Williams explaining how to remove that particular piece of software, because that's exactly what Williams had been doing as well. They had got their traction control in the gearbox software and it was switched off. So I'm not saying they were using it either, but the irony was that the bit of software that everyone was up in arms about being found by the FIA in the Benetton, if they'd have checked the Williams, they would have found it was in there too, doing exactly the same thing, the same reason. So, but you know, what you get is these things get so stuck in the mind of the fans that telling them what it was actually like doesn't go down very well. So I'm sure loads of people just don't believe it. So
we said that on an email yesterday, didn't we? That is often the case. Yes, obviously. Just quickly, we saw a comment here about JJ Leto. I know Rob's a fan of his. Very, very good driver, and that that shunt he had in testing really
It
affected him,
did.
didn't it? Because he was
Yeah, it was I think I don't really know. It was a horrific accident, and it knocked the stuffing out of the man. So he wasn't the same bloke afterwards. It was a horrific
yeah,
shank.
sure. I remember seeing him and Mika Hakkinen, I think 1 year after the other in British F3, and I remember thinking later was always better. Nothing against Mika, obviously, but I always thought
No,
later was
I
better.
was a fan, but you know, these accidents, they have physical and mental effects, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Just very quickly, you work with Michael Schumacher. We all know what's happened to him, and it's a tragedy, and one of the greatest champions we've ever seen. What was he like to work with in those early?
Well, you see, I started off in '92 with him before he, you know, he hadn't got any money. No, that was nobody knew. I mean, he knew he was going to make some money, so he got an apartment in Monaco, but he didn't have enough money to have a car. So when we were testing the Ricard, he used to show up for the test in Corinna's Mini, which was quite an old Mini. And back in the day, it was pretty standard stuff to play quite a lot of practical jokes on people, particularly cars. And for example, it was very common to find that the ignition switch had been connected to the windscreen washer switch, and the windscreen washer bottle had been connected underneath the steering column. So when you got in your car and turned the steer, you just got all the water from the windscreen washer in your lap. And those were the sort of things that people did. My favourite was connecting the brake light switch to the horn. They used to do that to the marketing people, because of course you did it to a mechanic, they could fix it within a yard. But if you did it to the marketing department, they drove through town blowing their horn at everybody every time they had to stop. So that was more fun. But I remember on one occasion somebody had wire wrapped a piece of fish to the exhaust manifold of Corinna's car for Michael to drive back to Monaco with, and that sort of thing. Water fights with yachts. We were all, well, they were young. I wasn't. I was getting on by then.
Yeah.
And the thing with Michael was that it didn't matter what went wrong with the car setup wise, he drove around it. If you put that, like, you know, if there was something wrong in the setup, I wouldn't say he didn't find it. It's just that almost didn't matter how bad it was. He found a line or a way of driving it which worked with that setup. That's why he was so quick when he only had fifth gear in Spain that year. I mean, the only time after he got used to a new line and what he had to do, the only place where he was genuinely slower was at the end of the straight when he should have been in sixth. It was just astonishing. And he had just completely changed his lines and where he throttled, where he braked to get the best out of the car. And so getting a good setup with him, it took me a little while to find ways of what question to ask him to work out what I needed to do. Because, of course, back then the data was pretty pitiful and didn't really help all that much. You very much relied on a good relationship between you and the driver, and you being able to work out from what he said which bit of the car you needed to work on.
Wow, that's amazing. I mean, just going back to that, I mean, it's just, you know, that's what made him so good, just adapting to things, and superb. Just before we jump on, great question here on Twitter, STP_kit. Hello. This is a great question. What was the aerodynamic influence of the onboard cameras in the early 90s? Obviously, there weren't many that had them. I always remember Nakajima having one, and every time they put the camera on the car, someone crashed. I always remember that.
No,
I remember Nakajima.
Was
it in
did try and make
Mexico?
them have a minimal effect, but of course, we used to move them around to see if we could find somewhere we could put them where they were better. For example, if you mounted them on the outside of the rear wing end plate, but not too high, they actually made the rear wing work better. So, of course, what did we do? So yes, people found ways of making the car work better, but we ended up having to carry a dummy if you didn't have them. Go.
Okay. Yes. Sure. Very cool. Good question, and like that. just got very quickly going to touch on the FW14. I know you said it was Adrian Newey's chief
Absolutely,
designer,
yeah.
and it was all, but obviously it used the principles that you developed with active suspension and things like that. That was a heck of a car, wasn't it?
It was.
Heck of a car. Heck of a car.
I mean,
Championship winner.
basically, using the active suspension allowed you to make a much more pointed aero because you knew you were going to keep it in the sweet spot all the time. You could have a very pointy aero. It was a bit like CVTs. You could have a more highly tuned engine. Because if the car was going to move around in ways that you couldn't control very well, you would end up in an aero area where it might go unstable if you weren't careful. But with the active suspension, you could really, have it running at the best downforce and balance level all the time, really, and dump drag on the straight and all sorts. So it's good piece of kit, really. It's a shame it's not still legal because it actually makes the car safer, in my opinion. I mean, obviously it's more complex and heavier, but on the other hand, it's more stable. I think it was a good thing. I think it would be a good thing even now.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there was a question earlier on saying, was it annoying when they banned it? Because obviously the work had gone to waste.
Annoying, and I think, again, it was one of those things people didn't realise how much more stable and safer the car was with it. I mean, I suspect, that I'm pretty sure that Senna's accident happened because his tyre pressures had dropped. I've spoken about it before. I mean, I know there are loads of opinions, but anyone who's spent their time in a wind tunnel like I have has seen things that most people wouldn't believe about height sensitivity of flat bottom cars. And if the tyre pressures were low, he was in the shed. And that's what Michael, who'd been following him, he wanted doing to his car after Senna's accident for the restart was raising it, and he was completely sure that it was the floor that had hit the ground, and that's what had caused him to go.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is, there's so many conspiracy theories about that, isn't there? And all these theories about people who, I hate to say it, haven't got a clue what they're talking about. And I'm not saying I do have a clue what I'm talking about, but I'm not one of the conspiracy theorists.
Well,
I mean, Michael Schumacher and Frank.
Well, I mean, the thing is that the Renault guys say there was still torque on the steering column up to impact, and if the steering column had broken, causing the impact, they wouldn't have been able to have any torque. So, whilst it was clearly broken, and whilst it also is clearly a shit bit of design, frankly, it's far more likely that the aerodynamic instability caused the accident than a broken steering.
Sure. And if Michael Schumacher and Frank Dernie say that, then I am
it's more
absolutely
likely.
going
I'm
to
not
go.
saying for sure, but that's the most likely.
Yes, that's the way I will certainly. I would certainly lean. Just want a quick one. You had very limited input, I believe. I'm not sure on Damon Hill, Arrows A18. We all wish he'd won. Everyone does. I think even Jacques Villeneuve feels bad about Hungary. That car seemed to have some potential in it, but it never quite realised.
Well, again, it was one of those things. We didn't have time. I was technical director there when we designed it, and when Tom was showing people around the factory, I remember him saying, "Well, I can't show you through there because our 5-axis machine is machining our new monocoque." Behind those doors at that time, they hadn't even concreted the floor yet. We hadn't got a 5-axis machine, and we hadn't known who the driver was going to be, so we couldn't finish doing the monocoque. So it was a nightmare to do that car. I think Tom had promised things that there was no way we could ever have done, and therefore people were disappointed when, we went to the first race with almost all of the hydraulic seal parts not to drawing because we didn't have time to get ones to drawing. So I knew it was going to leak all its hydraulic fluid out. I just didn't know when. And so sure enough, it was very depressing because, of course, it could have done better. And in fact, the one thing that we were trying to get better, to match the tyres better. And I had it was nice and light. And I had a theory that putting some more weight forward would make the front tyres work better. And so we ordered 2 pieces of tungsten, which we bonded into the front wing main plane, because that was the furthest forward and the lowest, and therefore had the biggest effect. And I left. I resigned from the company over titanium uprights, which sounds small. I won't go into the detail, but Tom was determined to have them, and we were sure they were a waste of money. And I thought, well, if he's just going to do what he wants anyway, I'm off. I've had enough. I'd had it up here with Tom by then, and but we did test those bits, and the race engineer, who's a friend of mine, rang me up afterwards and said, "You can't believe how much better the car is now with these." And sure enough, those what he had on in Budapest. It was the first time it ran.
I see.
So I was disappointed it didn't win as well, but there we are. But the car was never going to be reliable. We changed changed sourcing of bits for various reasons. It was a shame because there were some very good people there, and Tom was a very good boss in many ways. He just was too impatient to do in 6 months what was going to take 3 years.
Right. Yeah.
It's not uncommon. I reckon it takes 5 years if you've got a team to get the people together. First, you've got to decide who's good in the team and who you want to keep. Second, you've got to target replacements for those who you don't think are going to carry forward. Then you've got to offer them a job, which they may or may not take. If they're any good, they'll have at least 6 months notice. So by the time you've found out what you want your team to be and got them all together, you're in for 2 years. You've then got to get them all working and pulling together. So you really start designing a good car after 3 years. And your good car might or might not be reliable enough. So I reckon if anyone asked me, it takes 5 years to get the team together and produce a race-winning car. And nobody who raises money, no sponsor getter, is going to ever be able to persuade a sponsor to give you a 5-year budget. So there's the dilemma.
Sure.
Unless you start off with loads of money, you're knackered.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, time is not the sponsor's friend. Okay, I want to touch on 2 things before we go on, just before we wind down, because I'm conscious of the time. Chris McMahon, hello again, Chris. How competitive do you think Prost would have been in the 92 Ligier compared to how Boutsen and Comas fared? Because he was testing incognito in Comas's helmet, wasn't he?
Well, we did 2 tests with him. Now, Alain is fantastic. He was really one of the drivers I worked with, even though it was only for those tests, who asked really sensible questions. For example, no, everyone says, "Oh, Monaco is all mechanical. You're not going fast enough for aerodynamics." Well, that's bollocks, because any extra grip helps. And Prost asked me, he said, "Why is it that even though it's a slow track, a bit more rear wing is better at Monaco?" Now, most drivers would just assume it wouldn't be, so had never really tried it. He tried it. He tried everything. The other thing is, because Thierry was actually a mate of Senna's, they were really close. They were socially close. And at that time, Alain very definitely was not. So he would do anything to run down Thierry. He really would. So he went to an enormous amount of trouble without being overt to be much faster. When we did a qualifying sim, he was about 2 seconds lap quicker than Thierry. And on the race distance they both did, he was well over a second a lap quicker on average. I seem to remember 1.6, but that does sound like a lot. And in fact, to the extent that in the end, we stopped the test with Thierry and took the car back to find what was wrong with it. We thought there must be a crack in the chassis or something like that. There was that big a difference. And we went to the first race with Prost's car. I mean, it was set up with his pedals, his seat and everything. We were expecting Prost to be driving the car. What's that? And so, yeah. And I understand that he basically said he'd drive it if Guy gave him the team or some such thing. But it was a great disappointment because it totally demoralised Guy, because I know a lot of people didn't get on with Guy. He was like my dad. I liked him. He had a lot of the personality of my father, who was a strong character as well, who died when I was 23. But Guy, we go to the race and you get your FIA timesheets, and you'd see on Guy's sheet, he'd marked where Prost would have qualified. You know, how much faster than Boutsen he was. Now, I should also say, at that time, by contract, we had to have an inferior engine to Williams. We weren't allowed to have the latest spec Renault engine. And so we didn't really expect to be able to beat them. But if you looked at the time Prost would have done, we would have been really close. And the whole history of Ligier would have been different if Prost had driven, in my opinion. Because Thierry was I mean, he was a great driver, but he wasn't at that level.
Wow. I'm now wishing.
I
wish he.
I mean, Prost, I know, feels that he's not as highly rated as he deserves, and I think there's a lot right about that. If you, I know it upsets some people, but the fact is that over the last 70 odd years of Formula One World Championship, the world champion has almost every year been the better of the two drivers in the best car. It almost never happens any other way. But in 1986, Alain Prost was world champion in a car that broke down from time to time, but every time he finished, nobody could have scored more points than he did. Whereas both Nigel and Nelson had silly crashes. I mean, Nelson knocked all the wheels off in Detroit when he didn't need to. Nelson and Nigel crashed with Senna on lap 1 of the first race in Brazil, doing a stupid overtaking maneuver. You know, whilst the car wasn't perfect, the drivers made more errors between them than Prost did. So Prost was one of the very, very few drivers who won the world championship when he wasn't in the best car. So yes, I'm a fan.
Absolutely. And this is again controversial, but someone actually said, and I thought there's probably something to it. He said that Alain Prost would be regarded higher if Ayrton Senna hadn't been killed, and I think it just sort of it gave Senna something, and I thought there's something in it. I'm not sure it's fully right,
who
but
knows?
I think,
the one thing I'm fairly sure of is that the Williams, I think the gap between Ayrton and Damon was marked, should we say. I don't know what it was because they didn't drive together for long enough to be sure. But I think that when you look at how close Damon ran Michael to the championship in '94, my view is that if Senna hadn't been killed, he would have been world champion that year, and maybe several others if you look at how quick I think you could probably bet that Senna would have won the championship both the years that Damon won and the year that Villeneuve won. That would be my guess. So maybe he wouldn't. Maybe, who knows?
Sadly, we will never know. Just one thing I want to touch on very quickly. IndyCar. Someone did put, I'm not a big fan of IndyCar, always have been. If there's time, could you talk about the level of technical competition, just very briefly in IndyCar, or did you find it too basic?
No. I mean, it was a proper ground effect car. The car, championship racing car. I was never IndyCar. I didn't do. I went to Lola to help them out when it had gone bust, and Martin Bahrain just wanted someone experienced to help Ben Bowlby, who was the chief designer and was quite young. And Ben's a really smart guy, and so I went and I did some race support. I helped, point him in the right direction in the wind tunnel and all that sort of stuff. But so I was just a consultant. But technically, when I started, you could have Penske were building their own car. There was the Swift. There was the Reynard, which at the beginning was the most competitive. And there was the Lola, which everyone had got rid of. And in fact, we got about 30% more downforce out of the Lola because the aero guy at Lola thought nothing could be done to make it any better. But Ben, and with his persistence and a bit of guidance, they got So eventually the Lola was the quickest car, and Swift gave up. Penske bought a Lola. Once it was clear the Lola was quicker than the Reynard, no one wanted a Reynard, so Reynard went. Then it became a one-make formula, and it's shit again. You know, one-make formula is the invention of the devil. I hate them.
Yeah, yeah. Because you were there, was it with Montoya?
Well,
Was it
I
you
was
were
there with
working-
Lola, so supporting any driver that had a Lola. And Montoya was one
Okay.
I got on really well with. So, yeah, because he was quick and he would try anything. And once you have a good relationship with a driver who, i.e., you try something that's a bit off the wall and it works, yeah, you're away then.
Then you're
Yeah,
well
and,
in, yeah.
and you can
you
make
helped him
good
again.
progress then.
Yeah, and you helped him again when he was Williams, wasn't he? You came back Williams, and was it in Austria or something? You
Yeah,
tweaked the back of the
Patrick
car
had
and-
asked me to go because he was very fed up that he thought they had quite a good car and they really weren't getting that good results, and he wanted some help with the setup. And as again, he's my mate, but it's typical that if you ask someone for some help, whatever their suggestion is, you're not going to believe it, because if you had thought that was the problem, you would have needed the person in the first place because you'd have done it yourself. So this,
Right, yeah,
what I
yeah.
considered after the first test we did was the solution. Patrick didn't think much of, but we did it, and it did work. And I think Juan Pablo should have been world champion in 2003. The reason why he wasn't, and I know, was mainly this thing where Ferrari were very influential in claiming the Michelin tyres weren't legal because, you know, there was a working with rule, and the Michelin was right on it. But if you looked at a used tyre, it had got a little bit of dirt round the corner, and they said, oh, well, therefore it's using more than the allowable width. And Michelin ended up having to make narrower tyres, and that produced a bit of a otherwise we would have beaten Ferrari for sure. So that was a bit annoying.
Wow.
And Juan Pablo, I think if
Yes.
he'd been world champion in 2003, he wouldn't have got a huff and gone off back
Yes.
to America. But he never got on with Ron Dennis. He should never have gone there. There
No,
are other
absolutely not.
stories about that period which are a shame. I loved him. He was a great guy to work with and a real character. As a driver, very like Nigel Mansell, actually. There's a car in front there, I'm going to overtake it. And he would find a way. You know, he was just an amazing racer. And I think it was a tragedy he wasn't in Formula One for longer.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, I saw him race at the Indy 500 in 2022 in the flesh, and he just looked more in control, or just very. You could tell there was a top drawer driver underneath that helmet, and that does answer a question that came up from our pal in Italy, Christian Andrea Arcuri, who asked, "Would they have won it in 03?" Which is true. I mean, there's so many things we could talk about, but this 2 hours, it's flown. It's absolutely flown by.
Well,
as
the
it always
problem
does.
is,
I have
you
to skip.
know, I'm a very old bloke who was in motor racing for a very long time and has got a lot of stories.
We love it. We love it. We love it. And I could sit here and talk all night, and I'm sure people would love to, but we can't, unfortunately. But I mean, there's some things that we're gonna have to skip over, unfortunately. Just quickly, before we get into some little fun questions, which I'd like to wind down with, we've got to mention Adrian Newey, because as a designer, what he's done with Red Bull and everywhere he's been, certainly at Red Bull at the moment, it's incredible, isn't it? Where everything he touches seems to turn to gold. And I've always said there's always a debate about who's the best driver in history, and it's going to come down to different eras and whatever. There's very rarely a debate about who the best car designer is, because everyone seems to go to Adrian. Obviously, you're mechanically minded and you're in that kind of field. I was wondering, I mean, you must think he's right.
Yeah, I think he understood also that aero was important. And the one thing, this again is controversial, a bit of the problem of how do you learn your trade as a car designer? Because you need to know which bit of the car is important. And the way you do that, way you did it back in the day, was as a young guy, you get thrown in the deep end with a Formula Ford car like, I don't know, Rory Byrne, or a March Formula 3 car like Adrian, and you get sent to a race as a support engineer, and the driver would chew your ear off about whatever it did. And you would think about it and think, well, if I do this and that, I wonder if that'll make it better. So you try a couple of things, and sure enough, you learn what works. And you can't do that now because they're all one make formulae. So the concept side is something that you can no longer learn. And I would say that Adrian Newey today is the youngest engineer working in Formula One who's had a full formation period, and he's 63, something like that. None of the people younger than him will ever be able to do what he can do because they're not allowed. They don't have the opportunity in Formula 3. They don't have the opportunity in Formula 2. They don't have the opportunity in Formula 1 because you're not allowed to go testing. You've got 24 races and a simulator. And the simulator, there are 2 or 3 things on a simulator that you can't do. And they only get a couple of days circuit testing. So it's crap. So I don't think that there is any way in which someone, even if they have the same talents and the same opportunities in terms of budget and so forth that Adrian has had, would ever be able to do what he's done, simply because the training is no longer available.
Yeah,
the
absolutely. And yeah, he's probably the last of his type. I just had a very quick look. He's 65.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Keith Mel. I'm not a fan of John Barnard, by the way. There's a guy. Well, I'd say I'm not a fan. I know he's he was very good at the bullshit, I would say.
Right. Okay.
I know several other people who've worked with him who say he's better at bullshitting the journalists than he is at understanding the car. I mean, I'm sure he was a good mechanical designer and all that, but
I see.
He made an awful lot of money at it.
Okay, perhaps
I'm not. I mean, I am a fan of quite a few designers, and John's not one of them.
Okay, well, fair enough. That's fair enough. You know, we all like different people for different reasons. What we got here? Not a problem. They're saying keep going. Well, we'd love to keep going, but we're getting.
I'm usually in bed by now.
I know. I was going to say yes. What we go? We're mentioning about the Railton Mobile. Yes, Reed Railton. Yeah, we know him as well. Colin Chapman. They're like, oh goodness me, all the names are coming in.
There's a smart bloke, but I mean, as much as anything, he was a smart businessman, and he knew. He did. I mean, Adrian gets his pencil out. Colin had other people doing that. He gave direction and gave budget, and was a very clever bloke with a lot of clever ideas in the earliest days. But he was running a business. Car company.
He was more business.
He wasn't standing at a drawing board all day like some people did.
No, sure. No, great stuff. Okay, just a few little fun questions just to wind down. I mean, I could sit and talk until 6 a.m. I'm sure we could, but let's not. We could do with some sleep. But okay, let's have a look. Oh, firstly, I've got to say one thing. Chris Whitty, he's become quite a good sort of pal, and he's come on here, and I have to mention, he's asked me to mention to you
the P1 powerboat race.
Yeah, the powerboats. Chris loves his powerboats. Yeah. Just a few little recollections of your time there.
While I was doing consultancy, being self-employed, you need to do more than just one. You need to justifiably be a self-employed person. You need to have more than one client, otherwise you have to be an employee. And so I did various bits and pieces. One of the things I did was be the FIA technical delegate for classic Formula One. So I could do things like write little things about how to repair a carbon fiber piece, or which steel you should be using, because some of them had got no idea. So I did that sort of thing. I did it. Now then, what was the link? Steve Lydon was the guy who was running Thoroughbred Grand Prix. I don't know, as it was then, and he was the guy that persuaded me to come and do this FIA technical delegate thing. And and he then started working for a guy who was running this P1 powerboat race. And he just rang me up and said, do you want to come to a few powerboat races? I don't know that much about it, but and in fact, luckily, there were two perfectly good technical guys who did know something about it, who I worked with. But yeah, I did see Chris Whitty there because he was obviously into his powerboats, and Tiff Needell used to come and commentate on them as well. So there's a picture somewhere that somebody was
I saw Tiff on
me
Saturday.
and Chris and Tiff. But it was fun. I'm still in touch with one of the guys who was what you might call a technical scrutineer with me. Races himself now. I'm still in touch with him. He has a great time. They're amazing things, powerboats. Bloody dangerous.
Yeah, well, and they've been kind of like reborn. Some other racing drivers have gone out into it this year, and it's all seems to be taking off, which is fantastic. I saw a bit when I was down at Uni in Plymouth. They had a little race there, and it is fantastic, absolutely fantastic stuff. Crazy, absolutely crazy. But okay, so yes, there you go, Chris. I said I'd drop that in. Okay, fun questions. What was the toughest project that you worked on that gave you the most headaches in F1? Were there many?
I mean, I didn't have the attitude of what's tough. I suppose the Arrows experience was a tough one because I had been seconded to Ligier. I was chief engineer of Benetton and technical director of Ligier at the same time. And when I went to see Flav because my contract had come to an end, he said, well, you better go and talk to Tom because Tom's going to buy Ligier off me. So there's no point in talking to me. So I went to see Tom. And Tom said, yeah, I'm going to buy Ligier. And he did a contract with him. But my contract was with Tom, not with Ligier. Right. So
not Ligier.
Anyway,
okay.
So I'm in charge of Ligier. I start hiring some of my favorite people that I like working with. You know, Steve Clark, Loic Bigwa, these guys, 3-year contract, come and work for Ligier. And all of a sudden, Tom says, I've decided not to buy Ligier. I can't do a deal with Flavio. I'm going to buy Arrows instead. So there's me looking a complete twat to my mates because they've just signed a 3-year contract to work for me at Ligier and go to Arrows too late to do the job as well. Some brilliant people at Arrows. No, not going to knock them. But it was all just too late. Plus, I didn't know any of them. And the guys I did know thought I was an arsehole because I'd gone off. So that was the whole Arrows thing was tough. And, you know, then having things like, oh, we're going to change supplier. Oh, well, they've never made these things before. Oh, yeah, but they're a good supplier. We like that, you know. And you know, it's where you things like the seal, the O-ring grooves that just weren't machined to drawing and that sort of thing and found too late to rectify. So you were going to races knowing that you hadn't got a car that could possibly finish, not knowing how long it would be that it would last. That was a massive, massive nightmare. That was. Yeah. And eventually, Tom, he just came and said he wanted titanium uprights because they were lighter. I'll tell the story. And they were so expensive. They were going to be made by an independent contractor who actually was John Barnard, who was an expert at making titanium parts. But they were very expensive. And I looked at the difference in weight. And it turned out the difference in weight between the steel one and the titanium one was pretty well exactly the same as a set of brake pads. So I said to Steve Clark, who was doing dynamic chassis testing on the 4-post rig, do a test and then take the brake pads out and do another test. And let's see how much of a mechanical bounce gain we'll get by putting titanium uprights on. He did the test and pretty well no difference. I mean, any difference within experimental error. So I thought, well, there we are. We can save some money. It's pointless putting them on the car. So I went to see Tom and said, we don't need the titanium uprights. We've done the test and they're no better. I want them anyway, he said. So I went back to my office and resigned. You know, half an hour later, he had my letter in his hand. And I drove home and didn't go back.
Wow.
He did pay me to the end of my contract, so I never, unlike some people who think he cheated all the time, he never asked me to cheat. As I said before, everyone knows that I'm a bit anti that.
Yeah. Wow.
So yeah, that was the end of me
Time. Tricky
and
time.
arrows, and that was the worst period of my career, really. And I never really got a chance to
Yeah.
say goodbye to anybody or anything, so I just went home pissed off.
Yeah. That's a shame. Yeah. So, best car you worked on. Now, I've read about this, and I think I might know the answer. But what was the best
Well,
car that
my
you worked
favourite was
on?
the 08, really, because it
Oh,
had
wait.
a phenomenal L over D, and we actually, I know that everyone says, oh, he was lucky to win, and in many ways he was, but he did win. We won the championship against cars that had 160 horsepower more than we did. So yes, I like the 07 as well,
Yeah.
the 11 as well. That's another thing,
Yeah.
everyone, including Lotus themselves, was completely convinced in 1986 the only reason we were winning because we had the Honda engine. So they had persuaded Honda also that they were a much better car design company than Williams were, and that they should get the Honda engine. So we arrived at the Rio test for 87. And all the Honda hierarchy and all their development program was all in the Lotus garage. We just had a couple of junior engineers and mechanics on our car. And I thought, well, fair enough, because I used to run the Rio test. It was the first test of the year. I thought, well, fair enough. And we went out and on the same fuel consumption, we had 2 seconds lap quicker than them. So their chassis was shit. And in fact, probably the Renault engine was better than the Honda because they were never competitive again once they got the Honda. If you look at they were competitive in 86 and in 87 they weren't. And
Yeah.
the Lotus, when I went to Lotus, the Lotus guy said, yeah, we went slower when we put the Honda engine in. So it's a bit sad. That's another thing that not many people realize. And it's not 100% guaranteed to be true, is it? But they were certainly slower. And I mean, I remember Senna lying underneath our car. When we came back from lunch, there's Senna lying underneath our car looking at what the floor looked like because obviously he decided the Lotus floor wasn't for him. Very competitive guy. So yeah, that was a good car, the FW11, and the 11B. The mods were small between the A and the B, but they definitely seemed to make it quicker.
Yeah, fantastic. It's one of my favourite cars ever, as I've said.
It was one of my favourites. It was the first one where, I mean, mastering the cooling, the ducting through the radiator, getting the radiator blockage, the duct shape and everything right, made an amazingly big difference, the aero of the car. That was the biggest difference between the FW07, 07B, 07C, 08, because the 08 was just a modified 07. It just looked a lot different because, well, it was the development direction. And, I don't know, 80% of that was improving using the airflow through the cooling and the car better. And the L11 was quite good at that, and the flow through the turbo and all that sort of stuff was carefully. In fact, that was one of the first time we realised that the Lotus probably wasn't as good or the Honda realised the Lotus probably wasn't as good as they thought. Was one of their engineers was in our garage measuring the turbo intake on our car, and he was measuring the wrong thing. And I told him he was measuring the wrong thing because obviously I was a bit pissed off. And it turned out that we had 0.1 of a bar less turbo back pressure than they did, and that's 30 horsepower or so, something like that, I think.
Wow.
So we were able to run more power than they were, as well as using less fuel.
Wow, and that's fantastic. I love all that. I love this.
I did.
Yeah.
But, it's not really interesting for the people who are interested in racing in general, is it? They're interested in daring do and drivers.
Yes, I love. And
I have to say, having said a bit that I was more interested in the car, I do want to say that the drivers in Formula One are astoundingly good. They are the best of the best in every year of Formula 2 or Formula 3. You go to a Formula 2 race and there's one or two drivers who are definitely better than all the others, and it's obvious. And they're the guys who have ended up eventually in Formula 1, then had years of experience. So the Formula 1 drivers are just spectacularly good, really. Yeah. I mean, so
Like, no one gets there without being very, very, very good,
Exactly. And
regardless
then
of what
once
people will
they've got
say
there,
about.
they get more and more experience, and
Yeah,
experience brings. So they are just astonishingly good. So you pretty well know if you're working with an experienced Formula One driver, you're not questioning the driver. That's not
yeah,
an issue.
yeah, absolutely. And
Whereas with champ cars, you
it's
might have been.
yeah. I mean, that's. Yeah, I'm going to bring Lance Stroll in here because he gets a lot of stick. Yeah, he's a champion. He's a multiple champion. Yeah, and
Yeah,
he's always going to get that leveled at him because of his
he's
dad.
better
But
than me. I mean, they're going to be jealous of him because he's rich. But the fact is, he's pretty
he's
damn
good.
good, isn't he?
He's very good at. Yeah, he can drive a car.
The one thing though is that people have got the ambition to have a fast car and do a good qualifying lap. You know, you get that from the commentators. Even Davey Cool thought, "Oh yeah, qualifying." The fact is that one fast lap is only one step on a ladder.
Yeah.
It's true that if you haven't got a fast car, you're not going to do much winning. But once you've got a fast car, there's a whole range of things you need to learn to do well before you can win a championship with it. And some teams never even get the opportunity to have a fast car, never mind learn all those other things. So I was pretty lucky because by the age of 29 or so, I had a car that was fast enough to learn how to win a championship with. And it took me a while to learn, but a lot of people end their career never having had a car fast enough to have learned those lessons.
Wow. See, these are all things that fans and people outside the ropes don't think about. So okay, there's so many questions coming in. We can't take them all, I'm afraid. I mean, you've got like
I mean, people talk about the fact is with a driver, most of them have left school at 14 to go go-kart racing.
Yes.
So their physics education is not going to be at a level where you would expect them to understand how the car works. What you need at the driver is for him to be really fast and really fit. And when he, you don't need him to understand how the car works. You don't expect him to. And this idea that, he's a great development driver, in my experience, is pure bollocks. It's not the driver who's going to make the car quicker. It's the engineer.
Not his job.
What the driver needs to do is be a consistent, brilliant bloke who can do fast laps all the time. And if there is a problem, tell you about it in a simple thing. Like Jones was great. Go race. I've got too much understeer at the hairpin. Oh, okay. Well, we'll soften the front bar. I don't know about that because it's not that good through the chicane. And he wouldn't have mentioned the chicane unless your solution to his biggest problem might make it worse. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
He was just brilliant at zeroing in on what he needed to fix first. That will give you his biggest swag of time. Then he would go on to the next thing.
And
he didn't try and make it more complicated than it was. So he was a brilliant test driver. He had no interest in how the car worked at all. He would just show up and say, "Oh, you're in the shit. We've got understeer," or "I'm going for a steak." But he just told you what you needed to know to fix it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, which is great. And I like
was
that.
Brilliant, Jonesy.
Yeah, you just need to know enough just to,
I mean, you need to be fast and you need to be able to feel where you're losing time.
Yeah.
And that's because that was the thing with Michael, because he could just drive the car, get the best out of it even when it didn't. That was how you had to say, well, where do you think you're losing time? Oh, maybe here. Maybe I'm having to turn in a bit early here. But he wouldn't complain too much because he could do it. You know what I mean? He could drive around any problem that the car had.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I love that. Love that insight. Terrific. Okay, quick one. From your time in F1, was there one car that you thought, let me get my hands on that? Was there one car that you thought had a lot of potential in it and you thought you could have really...
You don't, until you've run a car, you don't know it. So I wouldn't be able to say.
Yeah, fair enough. Thought I'd chance my arm. Okay, this is a tough one. You've worked with a lot of terrific drivers and things, right from like Rupert Keegan, Derek Daly, who've come on here for a chat, Jones, Reutemann, Rosberg.
I'm not going to tell you whose I thought the best was because they're all great in their own way.
Yeah.
I'll tell you.
Was there one that was good to work with and one that was bad?
Well, that's the other. Back in when I was at Williams, I used to do an after dinner speech or a between dinner main course and suite for RBS and for Hewlett Packard for the marketing department, because I had the experience. I've been there, and I used to do a talk, and it usually was a question and answer session. And Peter Phillips, the Queen's grandson, ex-Queen's grandson, worked for Williams, and he was the guy who managed this whole marketing thing, and he was determined to get me all flustered, you know. And on one occasion, that was one of his questions: who's the best driver you ever worked with, and who's the worst? And I didn't want to say, because you don't, you know, they're alive, and you don't want to say. And so so he was chuffed as anything about the fact that he got me all flustered. So at the next race, of course, he asked me the same question. Now, the bloke who did the after dinner speeches for RBS was Jackie Stewart. So he was also there getting ready to do his big speech at the end, which I'd usually gone before because I had to get an early night. Anyway, so I saw Peter coming this time, and so he came and he said, and who's the best driver and who's the worst driver you've ever worked with then, Frank? And so I said, well, I've been really lucky to work with some great drivers, you know, world champions, multiple world champions and everything. So I can't really say who's the best, but I'm told I was very lucky to never have to work with Jackie Stewart. So, of course, everyone laughed, including Jackie, and that got me out of the hole. And that's my answer to you.
So we'll go with that. Superb. Fantastic. Okay. Just one final question. I mean, it's been obviously an amazing career, and you've worked on and improved so many cars and things like that. You mentioned the win in Montreal and various other things. What was your favorite win or proudest moment? Do you have any kind of moment that you look back on and think that was a terrific job, well done?
Well, the 79 win at Montreal was one such, but the other one, I think, was turning the Williams round and coming first and second at Monte Carlo after the car had been a tyre eater before I went, because the setup we put on the car was pretty well all down to me and Juan Pablo. Yeah. I don't know that if I hadn't worked with Juan Pablo before, it was so off the wall what I thought would work and what turned out to work that I don't think it would have ever gone on the car if Juan Pablo hadn't been the driver.
Yeah, if it had been someone else.
The younger engineers thought it wouldn't work. Patrick thought it wouldn't work. In fact, I actually sold it to Patrick, not by lying to him, but I said, well, we're going to have to put some really soft front springs on it, Patrick. And he loves that, soft front springs. What I didn't tell him was we were still having a really stiff heave spring, because otherwise the downforce we were generating would have battered it. But he was very pleased because we needed to change the mechanical balance, and doing it with soft springs was what he wanted to hear. But it was for other reasons as well. But because we went with a setup. Anyway, I won't go. But that was great to have got first and second at Monte Carlo like that was good.
Yeah, and it to have been on your say so.
Well, I contributed quite a bit to getting that turnaround.
Yeah, a turnaround for a 1-2 at Monaco. That's pretty special, isn't it? It's pretty good.
Well, it was quite funny because Frank was chuffed as anything, obviously, and he said he put his he came up to me with his wheelchair and he said, "Welcome back, Frank." After Monaco, he was chuffed as anything.
That's terrific. Oh, I love that. I mean, as I said, I could sit and talk shop here for hours. But,
well, I can always talk about motor racing, as you can tell.
Yeah, it's time to. I mean, there's some lovely comments coming in. A cracking chat with some great insights. Thank you, Darren. Chris McMahon, great interview. Vitola is saying such a fantastic evening. It's gone so quickly, thoroughly entertained, and many, many more. It's been perfect for a nocturnal nerd. There we are. Yes, I think that describes us all very, very.
There's far more questions than we can possibly answer, actually.
Oh, absolutely. Unfortunately, we can't get to them all, but and it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, Frank. As I said before, you and the cars you worked on were a huge part of me becoming interested in motorsport. So thank you for starting it all for me, you and all your team. And I'm sure there's plenty of people in the comments who would agree. Thank you to everyone who's tuned in. Thank you for all the support. And we'll see you soon. But Frank, again, thank you very, very, very much for coming on. I've absolutely loved it. And it's been great hearing all of your stories from the past.
And I've got to go to the Heritage Workshop for a cuppa to see Jimbo.
Oh, absolutely. We'll do that. And if there's a spare seat.
There's a fellow I've worked with for many a year.
Yeah, fantastic. Great stuff. Thank you very much,
Excellent.
everyone. And thank you to you, Frank. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Great stuff. Good night, everyone, and we'll see you very, very soon.